The impact of past trauma. Have you ever wondered why specific experiences still haunt you, even after years have passed? You may have noticed patterns in your relationships or behavior that don't make sense. The impact of past trauma is here to help you make sense of it all. This book is for anyone who's ever felt the lasting effects of a painful experience, whether it's childhood trauma, relationship struggles, or the invisible wounds that time hasn't healed. This book is for anyone ready to reclaim their life from the grip of the past. Whether you're just starting your healing journey or looking to deepen your understanding, this guide provides insights, coping mechanisms, and hope. Let's explore, heal, and move forward together. Chapter 1: What defines a traumatic experience? Trauma is more than a one-time event. It's an imprint that lingers, shaping how we perceive ourselves, others, and the world around us. Understanding trauma at a deeper level means exploring not just the obvious but the hidden wounds that affect every aspect of life. In this chapter, we will dissect different types of trauma, the decisive role of perception, and the distinct differences between emotional and physical trauma. Understanding different types of trauma. Trauma doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It's not just car accidents, assaults, or natural disasters. Trauma can be acute, chronic, or complex, each with unique implications. Acute trauma happens when we experience a single, overwhelming event. Think of this as a sudden, life-altering experience, an accident, a death, or a violent encounter. Acute trauma leaves a deep imprint, but it's specific and event-based. Chronic trauma is the result of prolonged exposure to distressing situations. It could be living in an abusive household, dealing with long-term illness, or facing systemic discrimination. This type of trauma slowly erodes a person's mental, emotional, and even physical resilience over time. Complex trauma is more intricate. It results from repeated, severe experiences, often occurring during childhood or within relationships. It's not just about the individual events but how they compound, leaving lasting effects on self-esteem, relationships, and overall mental health. Understanding the differences between these types of trauma is critical because they manifest differently. Acute trauma might lead to immediate, intense reactions like panic or shock, while chronic trauma creates a more subtle but insidious degradation of mental health. Complex trauma, often misunderstood or overlooked, can be the hardest to heal due to its deeply embedded nature. The role of perception in trauma. Trauma is not solely defined by what happens to you, it's also how you interpret and internalize it. The same event can have vastly different impacts on two individuals. What makes trauma so individual is the role of perception. Perception shapes trauma. Two people can experience the same event, and one might walk away relatively unscathed while the other is deeply affected. This difference comes down to how each person perceives the experience. Did they feel helpless or overwhelmed? Did they have the emotional tools to process what happened? Your brain filters trauma. The mind is powerful in processing traumatic events. It might magnify some aspects and downplay others. Your brain will try to make sense of what happened, often labeling specific experiences as traumatic based on emotional significance rather than objective danger. Cultural and societal factors also play a role in how trauma is perceived. In some cultures, specific experiences are normalized, making individuals less likely to recognize trauma even when it occurs. Other cultures may amplify the emotional response, causing the trauma to feel more intense. Perception matters because it shapes how trauma affects you, your healing process, and your long-term mental health. Trauma is often thought of as an objective occurrence, but in reality, your mind's interpretation of an event defines how deeply it impacts you. Emotional versus physical trauma. It's easy to understand physical trauma, broken bones, bruises, or visible injuries, but emotional trauma can be more rigid to recognize and even more complex to heal. Yet, both types of trauma are interconnected and often intertwined in how they affect a person. Physical trauma is the body's reaction to an external force. This could be an injury sustained in an accident, an assault, or even from prolonged stress on the body, like in chronic illness. These injuries can heal with medical intervention, but the psychological scars left behind can be just as deep. Emotional trauma refers to the psychological and emotional wounds that may or may not accompany physical harm. It's the emotional shock and pain that lingers, often for years, affecting how you relate to yourself and others. The distinction is crucial, but it's also important to recognize that emotional and physical trauma often overlap. For example, someone who experiences a physical assault might recover from the physical wounds, but they may carry the emotional scars long after. Similarly, emotional trauma can manifest physically, with chronic pain, fatigue, or even immune system issues. Critical insight. Emotional trauma can be more debilitating than physical trauma because it often goes unnoticed and untreated. Physical wounds might get immediate attention, but emotional wounds are sometimes buried, ignored, or minimized. This neglect can worsen over time, creating patterns of avoidance, anxiety, or depression. How trauma imprints on the brain and body. Understanding how trauma imprints on both the brain and body is essential. Trauma rewires the brain, especially the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear. This causes you to react strongly to situations that remind you of the trauma, even when there's no real danger. The brain creates fear loops. Trauma triggers overactivity in the amygdala and underactivity in the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making. This combination makes it hard to think clearly in moments of stress, pushing people into fight, flight, or freeze responses. Trauma gets stored in the body. You may not always consciously remember traumatic events, but your body does. Chronic tension, tightness, or pain can be physical manifestations of trauma. This is why people who have experienced trauma often carry a heightened sense of anxiety or hypervigilance. Their bodies are stuck in a state of heightened alert. How trauma impacts children versus adults. Trauma doesn't affect everyone the same way. Trauma's impact on children drastically differs from how it affects adults. This is mainly due to the brain's development and the emotional resources available at different stages of life. Children's brains are more vulnerable. Children are forming their basic sense of safety, trust, and identity. Trauma can severely disrupt this development. When trauma occurs early in life, the brain is still forming critical neural connections, which can become altered by prolonged stress. As a result, childhood trauma can lead to developmental delays, difficulty regulating emotions, and even long-term issues with learning and memory. Adults have more coping mechanisms. Adults often have more life experience and emotional tools to handle trauma, though this isn't always the case. A significant difference is that adults are more likely to understand the traumatic event cognitively, but this doesn't mean they're less affected emotionally. The emotional scars can still be as deep, but adults tend to rely on more mature coping mechanisms, such as seeking therapy or rationalizing the event. Attachment and safety are key for children. Trauma often challenges children's sense of safety and attachment to caregivers. If a child experiences trauma in an environment where they are supposed to feel secure, such as their home, the damage can be more significant. This disruption in attachment can manifest as difficulty forming trusting relationships later in life. Emotional resilience can be built in adults. While trauma in adulthood can still be devastating, adults typically have greater access to resources and coping strategies. Therapy, support groups, and mindfulness can help adults process and heal from trauma. This resilience building is more challenging for children, who rely heavily on their external environment for support and validation. Critical insight. Childhood trauma often creates lasting impacts that carry into adulthood, particularly when it disrupts early brain development. Adults have more developed coping mechanisms, but that doesn't mean trauma leaves them unaffected. For both groups, understanding and processing trauma is crucial to healing. Individual versus collective trauma. Another key distinction in understanding trauma is the difference between individual and collective trauma. Trauma is often thought of as something personal and separate. Still, many traumatic events affect groups, communities, or even entire nations. Individual trauma. This is trauma experienced on a personal level. It's the direct result of events that impact you personally, such as an assault, the loss of a loved one, or a personal injury. The individual feels isolated in their pain, as the event is specific to them. Even when others can empathize, the personal experience of trauma can feel intensely solitary. Collective trauma. On the other hand, collective trauma refers to shared traumatic experiences. Wars, natural disasters, economic crises, pandemics, and acts of terrorism fall into this category. Collective trauma affects a group of people but also fosters a sense of shared experience. Communities affected by collective trauma often come together to support each other and make sense of the events. The impact of collective trauma. Collective trauma can sometimes be more complex to process because it becomes part of a shared cultural memory. Trauma isn't just personal, it's historical. Events like 9/11 or the COVID-19 pandemic leave a mark not only on individuals but on societies as a whole. People may feel a sense of community in the wake of collective trauma, but the grief and anxiety can also be amplified by the scale of the event. Cultural and historical trauma. Beyond immediate events, trauma can also be passed down through generations, creating a form of cultural or historical trauma. This is evident in groups that have suffered oppression, genocide, or colonization. The trauma doesn't end with the event. It gets embedded in the collective identity, influencing future generations. For instance, descendants of Holocaust survivors or indigenous populations carry the emotional weight of events that happened long before they were born. Critical insight. Trauma can be profoundly personal or shared by entire communities. Collective trauma can create bonds among survivors but also carries the weight of shared grief. Individual trauma can feel isolating, but both forms of trauma require acknowledgement and healing. The role of memory in trauma. Memory plays a crucial role in how trauma is processed, stored, and later recalled. Unlike ordinary memories, traumatic memories are often fragmented, disjointed, or wholly repressed. Trauma impacts how the brain records and retrieves these memories. Trauma and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for processing memories. When someone experiences trauma, stress hormones like cortisol flood the brain, disrupting the hippocampus's ability to function correctly. This can lead to fragmented memories or even memory loss about certain aspects of the event. Explicit versus implicit memory. Trauma can affect both explicit and implicit memory. Explicit memories are conscious, such as recalling specific details about an event. Implicit memories, on the other hand, are unconscious. They come through in the form of emotional reactions, physical sensations, or behavioral patterns without a clear narrative. For example, someone might feel extreme anxiety when hearing a loud noise without understanding that it's linked to an earlier traumatic experience. Flashbacks and re-experiencing. One of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks. This happens when a memory of the event is triggered, often involuntarily. Flashbacks are not just memories, they feel like reliving the event. During a flashback, the body and brain react as if the trauma is happening again. Repressed memories. Some people may completely block out memories of their trauma, mainly if it occurred in childhood. The brain uses this defense mechanism to protect the individual from the overwhelming emotional pain of the event. However, repressed memories can resurface later in life, often triggered by a specific event or experience that brings the trauma to the surface. Memory distortion. Trauma can also cause memory distortions. When we experience trauma, our brains are in survival mode, which can make it difficult to remember the event accurately. Details may be blurry, or certain aspects may be exaggerated. This isn't because the person is lying or fabricating the memory. It's a result of how trauma affects the brain's ability to process and store information. Critical insight. Trauma deeply affects memory. Whether through repressed memories, flashbacks, or distorted recollections, trauma alters the way our brain processes and stores experiences. Understanding this is crucial for healing because it highlights why traumatic events can feel so deeply ingrained and difficult to confront. The complexity of healing trauma. Healing from trauma is not a one-size-fits-all process. Trauma affects each person uniquely, and the path to recovery requires a personalized approach. Healing begins with understanding the complexities of trauma, how it manifests in the mind and body, and how it can be processed effectively. Healing through awareness. The first step in healing is awareness. Recognizing that you've experienced trauma, even if it wasn't dramatic or life-threatening in the conventional sense, is crucial. Many people dismiss their experiences because they don't feel they deserve to call it trauma. This mindset only deepens the wound. Acknowledging trauma, no matter the scale, is the first step toward recovery. Therapy as a tool for healing. Different therapeutic approaches are available for healing trauma, from cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. Each method offers tools for processing traumatic memories, rebuilding resilience, and regaining control over emotional responses. Healing in layers. Trauma healing often happens in layers. As you address one aspect of your trauma, other layers may emerge. This is normal and a sign that more profound healing is taking place. It's essential to be patient with the process and recognize that setbacks are part of the journey. The power of self-compassion. Trauma often leaves individuals feeling broken, ashamed, or powerless. Self-compassion is a powerful tool in the healing process. Rather than criticizing yourself for being affected by the trauma, allow yourself to feel the pain without judgment. This opens the door to more profound healing and acceptance. Building a support system. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. A robust support system, whether it's friends, family, or a therapist, plays a crucial role in helping individuals navigate the healing process. Trauma can feel isolating, but having people to lean on can provide the emotional support needed for recovery. Critical insight. Healing trauma is a multi-layered process that begins with awareness and acceptance. Therapy, self-compassion, and a robust support system are key elements of recovery. Trauma doesn't define you, but understanding its impact can empower you to heal. Trauma in everyday life. Recognizing the subtle signs. Trauma doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Sometimes, it's deeply embedded in our daily lives, influencing us in ways we don't immediately recognize. Understanding the subtle signs of trauma can help you see where it might affect your everyday thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Hypervigilance. One of the most common, yet often overlooked, signs of trauma is hypervigilance, a constant state of heightened awareness. If you frequently feel on edge or are easily startled, you might be living in a state of low-level anxiety, even when there's no apparent danger. This is your nervous system's way of staying alert to potential threats, a survival mechanism rooted in trauma. Emotional numbing. Trauma can make you feel emotionally distant or disconnected. If you find yourself having difficulty feeling joy, sadness, or even love, it might indicate trauma. Emotional numbing is a defense mechanism that helps protect you from overwhelming feelings but also dulls your ability to experience positive emotions. Avoidance behavior. Many people with unresolved trauma avoid anything that reminds them of their past experiences. This could mean preventing specific places, people, or even certain emotions. Avoidance is a subtle yet powerful sign that trauma is still influencing your behavior. It keeps you from confronting the root of the issue and hinders healing. Sleep issues. Trauma can disrupt your sleep, leading to insomnia, nightmares, or restless sleep. Your mind might replay the trauma during your rest, leaving you feeling drained and anxious upon waking. Over time, this lack of restorative sleep can worsen your overall mental health, making it even harder to cope with trauma. Chronic physical pain. Trauma often manifests physically in the form of chronic pain, especially in the back, neck, or stomach. This isn't just stress, it's your body holding onto the trauma. The link between emotional trauma and physical symptoms is real, and it's a powerful reminder that trauma impacts both mind and body. Relationship struggles. Trauma can make relationships difficult. You might find it hard to trust others or push people away before they can hurt you. Attachment issues often arise from past trauma, affecting how you connect with friends, family, and romantic partners. Perfectionism and control. Many people with trauma develop perfectionistic tendencies as a way to gain control over their environment. You may feel that if everything is perfect, nothing wrong will happen. While this might seem like a way to stay safe, it often leads to constant stress and dissatisfaction. Critical insight. Trauma shows up in the subtleties of everyday life, in how you sleep, interact with others, and feel emotional. Recognizing these signs is the first step to understanding how trauma might still affect you and how you can begin healing. How unresolved trauma shapes identity. Unresolved trauma doesn't just affect how you feel, it also shapes who you are. Over time, trauma can become so embedded in your psyche that it becomes part of your self-identity. The more extended trauma goes unaddressed, the more it influences your sense of self, behavior, and life choices. Trauma as a core identity. When trauma isn't dealt with, it can become a core part of how you see yourself. You might start defining yourself through the lens of what happened to you rather than who you are. This leads to a sense of victimhood or powerlessness, where your trauma becomes the most significant part of your identity. Self-sabotage and limiting beliefs. Trauma often leads to self-sabotaging behavior. If you believe you are unworthy or broken because of your trauma, you may unconsciously make choices that reinforce these negative beliefs. This could manifest as fear of success, relationship difficulty, or avoiding new opportunities. Unresolved trauma keeps you trapped in cycles of limiting beliefs that prevent you from reaching your full potential. Hyper-independence. Some people respond to trauma by becoming hyper-independent. They refuse help, avoid vulnerability, and believe they must handle everything alone. While independence can be positive, hyper-independence is often a trauma response, rooted in a fear of being hurt or let down by others. This extreme self-reliance can make it challenging to form close, meaningful connections. Inconsistent self-image. Trauma can distort your sense of self, leading to an inconsistent self-image. You might feel strong and capable one day, only to be overwhelmed by self-doubt and insecurity the next. This fluctuation makes it hard to trust your own judgment, causing confusion about who you really are. Fear of vulnerability. Trauma often makes people afraid of being vulnerable. If you've been hurt, you may protect yourself by building emotional walls. Over time, this fear of vulnerability becomes ingrained, making it difficult to connect with others on a deeper level. It also prevents you from seeking help, as vulnerability feels too risky. Projection of past experiences. People with unresolved trauma often project their past experiences onto current situations. If you've experienced betrayal or harm in the past, you might assume that others will hurt you similarly, even if there's no evidence to support this. This leads to mistrust and can damage relationships or lead to isolation. Living in survival mode. One of the most significant impacts of unresolved trauma is that it keeps you in a constant survival mode. You may feel like you're always on guard, waiting for the next threat, even when life is calm. This state of hypervigilance drains your energy and keeps you from fully engaging in life. Overachievement as a defense. Sometimes, unresolved trauma pushes people to overachieve to prove their worth. By constantly striving for success, you might be trying to distract yourself from the pain or seeking validation from others to fill the void left by the trauma. While achievement can be healthy, using it to mask unresolved trauma will eventually lead to burnout or dissatisfaction. Identity dissociation. For some, trauma causes them to feel disconnected from their identity altogether. This dissociation can manifest as a sense of detachment from reality, where you feel like you're watching your life from the outside rather than fully experiencing it. This disconnect makes it difficult to engage in life authentically, as you're not grounded in a strong sense of self. Critical insight. Unresolved trauma shapes your identity in profound ways. Whether it's self-sabotage, hyper-independence, or living in survival mode, trauma can distort your self-perception and limit your potential. Healing involves reclaiming your identity from the trauma and redefining who you are outside those experiences. The path forward. Recognizing and healing trauma. Recognizing trauma's impact on your daily life and identity is critical, but understanding it is only the beginning. The real journey starts when you decide to confront and heal from that trauma. The process is not easy, but it's necessary if you want to reclaim your life and rebuild your identity based on self-empowerment, not past pain. Acknowledgement. The first step in healing is acknowledging that the trauma exists. Denying or minimizing it will only allow it to continue shaping your life in harmful ways. Accept that trauma has influenced you, but recognize that it doesn't have to define your future. Seeking support. Healing is a process that often requires external help, whether through therapy, support groups, or trusted friends. Having a support system is crucial. Trauma usually leaves people feeling isolated, but recovery involves reconnecting with others and building meaningful relationships. Practicing self-compassion. Trauma can leave you feeling broken, but treating yourself with self-compassion is essential. Recognize that healing takes time, and it's okay to struggle. Be gentle with yourself and permit yourself to heal at your own pace. Breaking negative cycles. Once you understand how trauma shapes your behavior, you can begin to break negative patterns. This might involve setting healthier boundaries, learning to trust again, or letting go of perfectionism. Small, conscious changes can significantly improve how you live your life. Reclaiming your identity. Ultimately, healing from trauma is about reclaiming your identity. Trauma may have influenced your past, but it doesn't have to determine your future. By addressing unresolved trauma, you can redefine who you are, based not on pain but on growth, resilience, and self-discovery. Critical insight. Healing is a gradual process that requires acknowledgement, support, and self-compassion. The journey is about more than just recovering from trauma. It's about rediscovering and reclaiming your true self, free from the constraints of past wounds. Chapter 2. Trauma and the brain, the neurological impact. When we think about trauma, we often focus on its emotional toll, but its neurological impact is just as profound. Trauma alters the brain on a structural and functional level, affecting everything from processing emotions to forming memories. This chapter will explore how trauma rewires the brain, the science behind the fight, flight or freeze response, and how it disrupts memory formation. Understanding these neurological effects is critical to recognizing the depth of trauma's influence on behavior, emotions, and healing. How trauma alters brain structure. Trauma isn't just a psychological experience, it physically changes the brain. When you undergo traumatic stress, specific areas of the brain become hyperactive while others underperform. These changes can affect how you think, feel, and behave. The amygdala, the brain's fear center. One of the most affected areas in a traumatized brain is the amygdala. This almond-shaped structure is responsible for processing emotions, especially fear. After trauma, the amygdala becomes hypersensitive, causing the brain to react more intensely to potential threats. This is why people with trauma often feel like they're always in danger, even when there's no real threat present. The prefrontal cortex, the decision maker. Trauma also weakens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, decision-making, and impulse control. When trauma disrupts this area, it becomes harder to regulate emotions and think clearly in stressful situations. The ability to make thoughtful decisions is impaired, often leading to impulsive behavior or emotional outbursts. The hippocampus, memory and trauma. Trauma shrinks the hippocampus, the brain's memory center. This damage leads to fragmented memories, difficulty recalling events, or even complete memory loss regarding the traumatic event. The hippocampus is also responsible for distinguishing between past and present threats, so when it's impaired, the brain struggles to recognize that the traumatic event is over, leading to persistent feelings of danger and hypervigilance. Long-term effects. Over time, if left untreated, these changes in brain structure can become more ingrained, creating a brain that is constantly in survival mode. Chronic trauma, such as ongoing abuse or repeated traumatic events, exacerbates these changes, making it more challenging to shift from a hypervigilant state to one of safety and calm. Critical insight. Trauma physically alters the brain, particularly the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus. These changes affect how we process emotions, make decisions, and form memories. Recognizing these structural changes helps us understand why trauma can feel so overwhelming and challenging to escape. Understanding the fight, flight, or freeze response. At the core of trauma's neurological impact is the fight, flight, or freeze response. This is the body's automatic reaction to perceived threats, hardwired into our nervous system for survival. When trauma occurs, this response becomes overactive, dictating how we react to stress and danger long after the traumatic event has passed. Fight. The fight response is your body's immediate reaction to danger, preparing you to confront the threat head-on. Your muscles tense, your heart rate increases, and adrenaline floods your system. For some trauma survivors, this response manifests as anger, aggression, or a heightened need to control their environment. They may feel the urge to lash out or engage in confrontational behavior, even in situations that don't warrant such a reaction. Flight. The flight response triggers the need to escape from danger. Your body prioritizes running away or avoiding the threat at all costs. In trauma survivors, this can lead to avoidant behavior, such as avoiding certain places, people, or situations that remind them of the trauma. It can also manifest as anxiety, a constant urge to flee from any perceived stress or discomfort. Freeze. The freeze response must be more understood but just as important. When the brain perceives that fighting or fleeing isn't an option, it shuts down. The body goes numb, and the person may feel paralyzed or disconnected from the situation. This response is typical in people who experience overwhelming trauma, such as childhood abuse or severe neglect. It can lead to feelings of helplessness, dissociation, or emotional numbness. Why the fight, flight, or freeze response lingers. After trauma, the fight, flight, or freeze response can become overactive. The brain becomes conditioned to react this way, even when there's no real threat. Everyday stressors can trigger these intense survival responses, making functioning difficult. For trauma survivors, this can look like overreacting to minor stressors, feeling constantly anxious, or dissociating during stressful situations. Breaking the cycle. While the fight, flight, or freeze response is deeply ingrained, rewiring the brain's reactions is possible. Therapy, especially methods like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, can help trauma survivors recognize when they are in survival mode and develop healthier coping mechanisms to respond to stress. Critical insight. The fight, flight, or freeze response is the body's natural survival mechanism, but trauma causes this response to become overactive. Recognizing when you're in survival mode is the first step toward regaining control and healing from trauma's lingering effects. How trauma affects memory formation. Trauma doesn't just affect how we feel, it also affects how we remember. The brain processes traumatic memories differently than regular memories, often resulting in fragmented, distorted, or even forgotten memories. This disruption in memory formation can complicate healing, as trauma survivors may struggle to make sense of what happened or why specific memories feel incomplete. Fragmented memories. Trauma often results in fragmented memories, meaning the brain stores bits and pieces of the event rather than a coherent narrative. Trauma survivors might remember specific sensory details, such as smells or sounds, but not the entire sequence of events. This is because the brain prioritizes survival during trauma, storing only the most emotionally charged parts of the experience. As a result, the memory may feel disjointed and unclear. Dissociative amnesia. In some cases, trauma leads to dissociative amnesia, where the brain completely blocks out parts or all of the traumatic event. This is a defense mechanism designed to protect the individual from overwhelming emotional pain. However, these repressed memories can resurface later in life, often triggered by certain stimuli, such as smells, sights, or sounds that remind the person of the trauma. Flashbacks. Trauma can also cause flashbacks, in which the person relives the traumatic event as if it's happening in real time. Flashbacks are not just memories, they involve a full sensory re-experiencing of the trauma. This happens because the brain has stored the memory in a way that makes it feel like the event is still occurring, even though it's in the past. Trauma in the hippocampus. As mentioned earlier, the hippocampus plays a crucial role in memory formation. Trauma disrupts the hippocampus's ability to store memories properly, often resulting in incomplete or distorted memories. The hippocampus is also responsible for distinguishing between past and present, so when it's impaired, the brain has difficulty recognizing that the traumatic event is over, leading to a constant feeling of being stuck in the past. Emotional memory. Trauma also enhances emotional memory, meaning the brain may overemphasize the emotional aspects of the trauma while underplaying the factual details. This is why specific triggers, such as a loud noise or a particular smell, can cause an intense emotional reaction, even if the person doesn't consciously remember the traumatic event. Long-term effects on memory. Over time, the disruption of memory formation can affect a person's ability to recall even non-traumatic events. Trauma survivors often report having poor memory in general, as the brain's focus on survival can interfere with standard memory processing. This can make daily functioning more difficult, as even simple tasks like remembering appointments or recalling conversations become challenging. Critical insight. Trauma affects memory formation in complex ways, often leading to fragmented memories, dissociative amnesia, or flashbacks. The brain's altered ability to store and retrieve memories can make it difficult to process and heal from trauma, but understanding how trauma affects memory is the first step in regaining control. Healing the neurological impact of trauma. Understanding the neurological impact of trauma is essential, but the real question is, how do we heal from it? While the brain's response to trauma can feel permanent, the brain's neuroplasticity offers hope. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. This means that with the right interventions, the brain can heal and rewire itself, reducing the long-term effects of trauma. Mindfulness and meditation. Practicing mindfulness can help trauma survivors become more aware of their emotional and physical responses without judgment. Studies have shown that mindfulness practices, such as meditation, can reduce the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and increase the prefrontal cortex size, which helps regulate emotions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT is one of the most effective therapies for trauma. It helps individuals identify and change negative thought patterns, teaching the brain to respond differently to stress. By working through these cognitive distortions, trauma survivors can rewire their brain's habitual responses. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. EMDR is a specialized therapy that helps the brain process traumatic memories. Through guided eye movements, the brain is encouraged to reprocess traumatic events, reducing the intensity of the emotional and physical reactions tied to those memories. Exercise. Physical activity is not just good for the body, it's essential for the brain as well. Exercise increases blood flow to the brain, which can help repair damaged neural pathways and reduce symptoms of trauma, such as anxiety and depression. It also releases endorphins, which are natural mood boosters. Somatic therapy. Trauma often gets stuck in the body, leading to physical symptoms such as chronic pain, tension, or fatigue. Somatic therapy helps individuals release trauma stored in the body through movement, breathwork, and other body-centered techniques. This helps integrate the mind-body connection, facilitating healing on a deeper level. Critical insight. The brain's neuroplasticity offers hope for healing the neurological impact of trauma. Through therapies like CBT, EMDR, mindfulness, and somatic therapy, it's possible to rewire the brain, reduce symptoms, and move forward in the healing process. The impact of trauma on cognitive functioning. Trauma doesn't just leave emotional scars, it disrupts how your brain processes information. People who've experienced trauma often struggle with cognitive functions such as attention, memory, and decision-making. The brain's focus shifts from complex problem-solving to survival mode, where immediate threats take precedence over everyday tasks. Reduced attention span. One of the first cognitive functions to be affected by trauma is attention. Trauma survivors often have difficulty focusing on tasks, especially in stressful or unfamiliar environments. Their minds focus on identifying potential threats, even when none are present. This makes concentrating on work, conversations, or hobbies more challenging. Impaired decision-making. Trauma also affects the brain's ability to make decisions. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical thinking and decision-making, becomes less effective under stress. Instead of carefully weighing options, people who've experienced trauma might react impulsively or avoid making decisions altogether. Their brain prioritizes short-term survival over long-term planning. Memory problems. Trauma doesn't just disrupt memory formation during the traumatic event itself, it also affects general memory over time. Many trauma survivors report difficulty recalling everyday details, appointments, or conversations. This happens because the brain's energy is redirected toward managing fear responses rather than storing new information. Difficulty learning new information. Cognitive functioning extends to learning, and trauma can make absorbing new information incredibly difficult. The brain becomes so focused on survival that new learning takes a backseat. Trauma survivors may struggle in school, at work, or in any situation that requires the teaching of new skills or concepts. Cognitive fatigue. Trauma leads to mental exhaustion. When the brain is constantly hypervigilant, looking for threats and managing stress, its cognitive resources become depleted. This results in cognitive fatigue, where everyday tasks feel overwhelming, even when they shouldn't. Over time, this exhaustion can lead to burnout, impairing cognitive function. Critical insight. Trauma significantly impairs cognitive functioning by affecting attention, decision-making, memory, and learning. The brain's focus on survival hinders its ability to manage daily tasks, making life after trauma both mentally and emotionally exhausting. Long-term effects of trauma on brain plasticity. One of the most profound ways trauma affects the brain is through neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself. While this plasticity allows for healing and recovery, trauma can alter brain pathways in ways that make recovery difficult. Understanding how trauma reshapes brain plasticity is essential for healing and preventing long-term damage. Chronic stress and neural pathways. Trauma often leads to chronic stress, which alters the brain's neural pathways. When stress worsens, the brain creates habitual patterns prioritizing survival over growth. This means the brain continually reinforces pathways related to fear, anxiety, and hypervigilance, making it harder to shift into states of relaxation or learning. Hyperactive amygdala and plasticity. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive after trauma, constantly scanning for threats. Over time, this heightened alertness causes the brain to rewire itself around fear and stress. The more the brain uses these fear pathways, the more ingrained they become, reducing the brain's ability to shift focus to non-threatening situations. Prefrontal cortex suppression. Trauma suppresses the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning, problem-solving, and regulating emotions. This part of the brain relies on neural plasticity to adapt to new situations and learn from experiences. When trauma diminishes activity, the brain struggles to adjust to change and adapt to non-threatening environments. The role of cortisol. Cortisol, the stress hormone, is released in large quantities during traumatic events. While cortisol is necessary for managing short-term stress, chronic exposure damages the brain's plasticity over time. High cortisol levels degrade connections between neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory and learning. Maladaptive plasticity. Trauma leads to maladaptive plasticity, where the brain adapts in harmful ways. Instead of learning and growing from experiences, the brain develops patterns of fear, anxiety, and avoidance. For example, someone who experienced trauma in childhood might develop hypervigilance that persists into adulthood, even when the original threat is no longer present. Can the brain rewire itself? The good news is that the brain's plasticity also allows healing. While trauma creates harmful neural patterns, it is possible to rewire the brain through intentional interventions like therapy, mindfulness, and meditation. These techniques encourage the brain to form new connections that promote emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility. Critical insight. Trauma disrupts the brain's plasticity by reinforcing fear-based pathways and suppressing regions responsible for emotional regulation and learning. However, the right interventions can rewire the brain, offering hope for long-term recovery. Practical steps for healing the brain from trauma. Understanding that the brain can heal is empowering, but how can trauma survivors actively support this healing process? The following practical steps leverage the brain's neuroplasticity to promote recovery. Engage in therapy. Therapy is one of the most direct and effective ways to heal from trauma. CBT and EMDR help rewire the brain, reduce emotional reactivity, and promote healthier cognitive patterns. Practice mindfulness. Incorporating mindfulness into your daily routine can help reduce stress and improve emotional regulation. Start with just a few minutes a day and gradually increase your practice. This helps strengthen the prefrontal cortex and reduce overactivity in the amygdala. Exercise regularly. Regular physical activity supports brain health by increasing the production of BDNF and reducing stress hormones. Even light exercise like walking or yoga can significantly affect how your brain processes trauma. Focus on nutrition. A diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and whole foods helps reduce brain inflammation and supports the growth of new neurons. Incorporate foods like fatty fish, berries, leafy greens, and nuts into your meals for optimal brain health. Improve sleep quality. Prioritize sleep by establishing a regular sleep schedule, reducing screen time before bed, and creating a relaxing bedtime routine. Quality sleep is crucial for the brain to process emotions and repair damaged neural pathways. Seek social support. Building and maintaining positive relationships helps counteract the effects of trauma. Fostering these connections, whether through family, friends, or support groups, helps the brain develop new patterns of trust and safety. Engage in creative activities. Activities that require creativity, like drawing, writing, or playing music, engage different parts of the brain and encourage neuroplasticity. These activities can help trauma survivors express emotions and foster cognitive flexibility. Critical insight. Healing the brain from trauma involves a holistic approach involving therapy, mindfulness, exercise, nutrition, sleep, and social support. By consistently engaging in these practices, trauma survivors can promote brain recovery and improve emotional and cognitive functioning. Chapter 3. The body keeps the score. Physical manifestations of trauma. Trauma doesn't just affect the mind, it also leaves a profound imprint on the body. The connection between trauma and physical health is often underestimated, yet it is one of the most critical aspects of understanding the full impact of trauma. This chapter will explore how trauma lives in the body, how it contributes to chronic pain, and the gut-brain connection in trauma recovery. Recognizing the physical manifestations of trauma is a crucial step in both acknowledging its depth and finding effective ways to heal. How trauma lives in the body. Trauma isn't just stored in the mind, it's held in the body as well. When you experience trauma, your body goes into survival mode. Adrenaline and cortisol flood your system, your muscles tense, and your heart rate increases. This is a natural response to immediate danger. However, when trauma isn't processed or resolved, the body holds onto these stress responses long after the threat has passed. Muscle tension. One of the most common ways trauma lives in the body is through chronic muscle tension. The body stays in a constant state of readiness, with muscles remaining tight and rigid as if prepared for the next attack. Over time, this leads to pain and stiffness, particularly in the shoulders, neck, and back. This physical tension mirrors the emotional stress that trauma survivors feel as the body remains stuck in a defensive posture. The nervous system's hypervigilance. Trauma causes the nervous system to stay on high alert, even when no immediate danger exists. This hypervigilance manifests in various physical symptoms, such as a racing heart, sweating, and shortness of breath. The nervous system's constant arousal is taxing on the body, leading to fatigue, insomnia, and difficulty relaxing. Essentially, the body forgets how to switch off its fight or flight response. Dissociation in the body. Trauma can also cause dissociation, where the mind disconnects from the body. People who've experienced severe trauma may feel detached or numb, as though they're watching their life from outside their body. While dissociation is a psychological defense mechanism, it also has profound physical effects. Trauma survivors often feel disconnected from their bodies, which can lead to neglect of physical health, poor posture, and a lack of awareness about chronic pain or illness. Trauma and immune function. Trauma can impair the immune system, making you more susceptible to illness. When the body is in a constant state of stress, it prioritizes survival over immune function. Over time, this chronic stress weakens the immune system, leaving trauma survivors vulnerable to infections, autoimmune disorders, and prolonged recovery from illnesses. Fight, flight, or freeze in the body. The fight, flight, or freeze response, which we discussed in Chapter 2, also manifests physically. In the fight response, your muscles become tense, ready for action. In the flight response, your heart rate increases, preparing your body to escape. In the freeze response, your body may feel numb or paralyzed, as if it's shutting down in response to overwhelming danger. These responses have physical consequences, even when no immediate threat is present. Critical insight. Trauma lives in the body through chronic muscle tension, hypervigilance, dissociation, and immune dysfunction. These physical responses mirror the emotional impact of trauma, making it clear that healing the body is just as important as healing the mind. Chronic pain and trauma. One of the most common physical manifestations of trauma is chronic pain. While chronic pain is often treated as a purely physical issue, many cases of persistent pain have roots in unresolved trauma. Trauma causes the body to hold on to stress, leading to pain that can last for years. How trauma triggers chronic pain. Trauma activates the body's stress response, flooding the system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this constant stress wears down the body's ability to recover, leading to inflammation and pain. This is why trauma survivors often experience chronic pain in areas like the neck, shoulders, back, and jaw. These parts of the body bear the brunt of stress and tension, and over time, the pain becomes ingrained. Fibromyalgia and trauma. There is a strong link between fibromyalgia, a condition characterized by widespread pain and tenderness, and past trauma. Many people with fibromyalgia report having experienced emotional or physical trauma earlier in life. This suggests that the pain associated with fibromyalgia may be, at least in part, the body's response to unresolved trauma. Migraines and headaches. Migraines and tension headaches are also common among trauma survivors. Chronic stress leads to muscle tension in the neck and shoulders, which can trigger headaches. Additionally, the hypervigilant state of trauma survivors can lead to an overactive nervous system, which is a known trigger for migraines. Pelvic pain and trauma. For trauma survivors who have experienced sexual abuse or assault, pelvic pain is a common symptom. The body holds onto the memory of the trauma, and this can manifest as pain or discomfort in the pelvic region. This kind of pain is often misunderstood or misdiagnosed, but it is a direct reflection of how trauma lives in the body. The cycle of pain and trauma. Trauma creates a cycle of pain. The more you experience pain, the more stressed your body becomes. This stress, in turn, increases the pain. Breaking this cycle is difficult, as the body and mind are locked into a feedback loop where physical pain and emotional distress reinforce one another. Why chronic pain is often misunderstood. Chronic pain that stems from trauma is often misunderstood by both medical professionals and the trauma survivors themselves. Because the pain isn't always linked to a specific injury or illness, it's easy to dismiss it as all in your head. However, the pain is real. It's the body's way of signaling that unresolved trauma is still affecting it. Key insight. Chronic pain is a common physical manifestation of trauma, often seen in conditions like fibromyalgia, migraines, and pelvic pain. The body holds onto trauma long after the event has passed, leading to pain that can persist for years. Recognizing this link is essential for treating chronic pain effectively. The gut-brain connection in trauma. The relationship between the gut and the brain plays a pivotal role in how trauma manifests physically. The gut-brain axis is a complex communication network between the gastrointestinal system and the brain, and trauma disrupts this connection in profound ways. How trauma affects digestion. Trauma triggers the sympathetic nervous system, putting the body into fight or flight mode. When this happens, non-essential functions like digestion slow down or stop altogether. Over time, this disruption to the digestive system can lead to irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, gastritis, acid reflux, and other gastrointestinal issues. Trauma survivors often report having sensitive stomachs, frequent indigestion, or unexplained digestive problems. The vagus nerve in trauma. The vagus nerve is one of the main pathways connecting the brain and the gut. Trauma can weaken the vagus nerve's functioning, impairing its ability to regulate the digestive system. A poorly functioning vagus nerve leads to problems like bloating, constipation, and food sensitivities. Strengthening the vagus nerve through practices like deep breathing or meditation can help restore balance to the gut-brain axis. The role of gut bacteria. Trauma can also affect the balance of gut bacteria, leading to dysbiosis, an imbalance of good and bad bacteria in the gut. A healthy gut microbiome is essential for overall health, including mental health. Dysbiosis has been linked to anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. Trauma disrupts this balance, leading to a vicious cycle where poor gut health worsens mental health, and poor mental health further disrupts gut function. Inflammation and trauma. Chronic stress from trauma increases inflammation throughout the body, including in the gut. Inflammation in the gut can lead to a host of problems, including leaky gut syndrome, where the gut lining becomes permeable, allowing toxins and bacteria to enter the bloodstream. This not only exacerbates physical health issues but also contributes to brain fog, fatigue, and anxiety. Trauma and appetite. Trauma can significantly impact appetite. Some trauma survivors may lose their appetite and experience weight loss, while others may turn to food for comfort, leading to emotional eating and weight gain. Both responses are tied to the gut-brain axis, as the brain and gut communicate about hunger, stress, and emotional needs. Healing the gut-brain connection. Healing the gut-brain connection requires addressing both the psychological and physical aspects of trauma. Therapies that focus on reducing stress and regulating the nervous system, such as somatic therapy or yoga, can help. Additionally, restoring balance is essential to supporting gut health through probiotics, anti-inflammatory foods, and stress-reducing practices. Key insight. The gut-brain connection is vital to understanding how trauma affects the body. Trauma disrupts digestion, weakens the vagus nerve, and leads to gut inflammation and dysbiosis. Healing the gut is a crucial part of trauma recovery, as it directly impacts physical and mental health. Breaking the trauma pain cycle. Recognizing the connection between trauma and physical pain is the first step toward breaking the cycle. To effectively address trauma-related pain, it's essential to approach healing holistically, addressing both the mind and body. Here are key strategies to interrupt the trauma pain cycle. Somatic therapy. Somatic therapy focuses on the connection between the mind and body, helping trauma survivors release stored tension and stress. Through techniques like body awareness, breathwork, and movement, somatic therapy can help release trauma from the body, reducing pain and restoring a sense of physical well-being. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. MBSR is a powerful tool for breaking the trauma pain cycle. By bringing awareness to the body and calming the nervous system, mindfulness practices help reduce chronic pain. They also allow trauma survivors to reconnect with their bodies in a healthy and supportive way. Yoga and movement therapy. Yoga is particularly effective in helping trauma survivors release tension from the body. It combines movement with breath, helping to restore balance to the nervous system and reduce chronic pain. Movement therapies focusing on gentle, mindful movement can also help restore the body's natural rhythm. Probiotics and gut health. Understanding gut health with probiotics and anti-inflammatory foods can improve physical and mental well-being. A healthy gut reduces inflammation and supports emotional regulation, making it easier to heal from trauma-related pain. Trauma-informed massage therapy. Massage therapy can help release tension stored in the muscles, particularly in areas like the neck, back, and shoulders, where trauma often manifests. A trauma-informed approach ensures that the bodywork is done in a safe and supportive way, allowing the body to release trauma without triggering emotional distress. Key insight. Breaking the cycle of trauma-related pain requires a holistic approach that includes somatic therapy, mindfulness, yoga, and support for gut health. Healing the body is a vital part of recovering from trauma, as the physical manifestations of trauma are often deeply intertwined with emotional and psychological distress. Trauma and immune system dysfunction. When the body is under constant stress, as it is after trauma, it goes into survival mode. In this state, all available energy is directed toward immediate survival, which comes at the expense of other crucial functions, including the immune system. Chronic stress and immunity. Trauma leads to chronic stress, weakening the immune system. The body is flooded with cortisol, a stress hormone that, while helpful in short bursts, becomes damaging with prolonged exposure. Elevated cortisol levels suppress the immune response, leaving the body vulnerable to infections, viruses, and chronic diseases. Inflammation. Trauma also triggers inflammation throughout the body. In the short term, inflammation is the body's way of healing. However, when the inflammation becomes chronic, it can lead to autoimmune diseases, joint pain, and other health conditions. Trauma survivors are at a higher risk for illnesses like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and fibromyalgia, which are linked to both immune dysfunction and chronic inflammation. Autoimmune disorders. There is a well-documented link between autoimmune disorders and trauma. When the immune system is compromised by trauma, it may start attacking healthy cells in the body, leading to autoimmune conditions. Trauma survivors are often diagnosed with diseases like multiple sclerosis, MS, Crohn's disease, and Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where the immune system misidentifies the body's own tissues as harmful. Susceptibility to illness. Trauma survivors often report being sick more frequently than others. This is because their immune systems are constantly working in overdrive to manage the stress of trauma, leaving fewer resources available to fight off common infections like the flu or colds. Over time, this constant battle weakens overall health. The long-term impact. Immune system dysfunction doesn't just happen immediately after trauma, it can last for years or even decades. Trauma survivors often experience long-term health consequences, ranging from chronic fatigue to recurring infections. Healing from trauma is not just about addressing emotional wounds, it requires strengthening the immune system to regain physical health. Critical insight. Trauma weakens the immune system by triggering chronic stress and inflammation. This leaves trauma survivors more susceptible to autoimmune disorders, frequent illness, and chronic pain. Recognizing this link is crucial for holistic healing. The role of somatic therapy in healing trauma. Traditional talk therapy is essential for healing the emotional and psychological aspects of trauma, but it often overlooks the body's role in holding onto trauma. This is where somatic therapy comes in. Somatic treatment focuses on the mind-body connection, helping trauma survivors release tension, stress, and trauma stored in the body. What is somatic therapy? Somatic therapy is a holistic approach emphasizing body awareness as a tool for healing trauma. It recognizes that trauma doesn't just live in the mind but also in the body. Somatic therapy helps individuals become more attuned to their physical sensations and teaches them how to release tension trapped in their muscles, tissues, and nervous system. Body awareness. One of the core components of somatic therapy is increasing body awareness. Trauma survivors often disconnect from their bodies as a coping mechanism, ignoring physical pain or discomfort. Somatic therapy teaches individuals to recognize where they hold tension, stiffness, or numbness in their bodies. This heightened awareness is the first step toward releasing stored trauma. Releasing physical tension. Trauma causes chronic muscle tension, especially in areas like the shoulders, neck, and lower back. To release this tension, somatic therapy uses techniques like deep breathing, gentle movement, and grounding exercises. By physically loosening the muscles, trauma survivors can begin to let go of the emotional stress that is tied to these physical sensations. Regulating the nervous system. The nervous system plays a central role in trauma. Somatic therapy helps regulate the autonomic nervous system, shifting it out of fight, flight, or freeze mode and into a calm state. Slow, deep breathing and progressive muscle relaxation activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and recovery. This helps trauma survivors feel safer in their own bodies and reduces feelings of anxiety or hypervigilance. Trauma release exercises. TRE. One effective somatic technique is trauma release exercises, TRE, which involve specific movements designed to release deeply held tension in the body. These exercises tap into the body's natural ability to shake off stress and trauma, helping individuals release tension from their muscles and nervous system. Healing through movement. Movement is a powerful tool in somatic therapy. Gentle, mindful movement, whether through yoga, stretching, or simple body movements, helps trauma survivors reconnect with their bodies healthily. Movement can break the cycle of physical tension and emotional distress, offering a pathway to healing both body and mind. Critical insight. Somatic therapy is essential for releasing trauma stored in the body. By increasing body awareness, releasing physical tension, and regulating the nervous system, somatic therapy offers trauma survivors a path to holistic healing that encompasses both the mind and body. Releasing trauma stored in the body. One of the most important aspects of healing from trauma is releasing the tension, stress, and emotional pain stored in the body. Trauma isn't just a mental experience, it becomes ingrained in the body's muscles, tissues, and nervous system. Understanding how to effectively release trauma from the body is critical to full recovery. The body holds trauma. When trauma occurs, the body responds by going into survival mode, muscles tense, the heart races, and adrenaline surges. If this stress response isn't resolved, the body holds onto it, storing it as physical tension and pain. Over time, this tension can manifest as chronic pain, fatigue, or bodily discomfort. Releasing this stored trauma is crucial for both physical and emotional healing. Movement and trauma release. Movement is one of the most effective ways to release trauma from the body. This doesn't have to mean intense exercise. Even gentle, mindful movement can help. Activities like yoga, tai chi, or qigong focus on slow, controlled movements that help the body release tension while calming the mind. These practices promote the release of stress held in muscles and tissues, allowing the body to return to a state of relaxation. Breathwork. Breathwork is another powerful tool for releasing trauma. Deep, controlled breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes relaxation and helps counteract the fight or flight response. Trauma survivors often breathe shallowly or hold their breath without realizing it, a sign of ongoing stress. Practicing deep, intentional breathing helps release this tension and signals to the body that it's safe to relax. Progressive muscle relaxation, PMR, involves tenseness and releasing different muscle groups in the body. This practice helps trauma survivors become more aware of where they hold tension and teaches them how to consciously relax those muscles. PMR is beneficial for people who experience chronic muscle tension as a result of trauma. Shaking and tremoring. One of the body's natural responses to trauma is tremoring, a shaking or trembling of the muscles, often seen after a stressful or traumatic event. This is the body's way of discharging built-up tension. As mentioned earlier, trauma release exercises, TRE, aim explicitly to activate this tremoring response, allowing the body to naturally release deeply held stress. Crying and emotional release. Emotional release, such as crying, is a natural and healthy way to release trauma. Many trauma survivors hold back emotions, but this only compounds the stress stored in the body. Allowing yourself to fully experience and express emotions, whether through crying, shouting, or even laughing, helps release the emotional and physical tension tied to trauma. Grounding techniques. Grounding techniques help trauma survivors reconnect with their bodies in the present moment, breaking the cycle of dissociation or emotional numbness. Grounding exercises like feeling your feet on the floor, holding a textured object, or focusing on the breath help bring attention back to the body, allowing trauma survivors to feel more in control and less overwhelmed. Touch and trauma release. Touch can be a powerful way to release trauma, mainly through massage therapy or craniosacral therapy. These practices work directly with the muscles, fascia, and tissues to release tension stored from trauma. A trauma-informed therapist can help create a safe space for physical release, allowing the body to let go of deeply held stress. Critical insight. Releasing trauma stored in the body requires movement, breathwork, progressive muscle relaxation, emotional expression, and grounding techniques. The body holds on to trauma in ways that talk therapy alone cannot address, making these physical practices essential for holistic recovery. Breaking the cycle of trauma in the body. Healing trauma is a holistic process that requires addressing the mind and body. While talk therapy helps process emotional and psychological wounds, somatic practices focus on the physical manifestations of trauma. By understanding how trauma lives in the body, how it disrupts the immune system, and how to release it, trauma survivors can take meaningful steps toward full recovery. Incorporate somatic practices. Include somatic practices like yoga, tai chi, or qigong into your daily routine. These gentle movements help release tension and restore balance to the nervous system. Practice deep breathing. Breathwork is one of the most straightforward yet powerful tools for calming the nervous system and releasing trauma. Start with a few minutes of deep, mindful breathing daily to help reset your body's stress response. Address chronic pain. If you experience chronic pain, recognize that it may be linked to unresolved trauma. Seek out trauma-informed therapies like somatic therapy, massage, or acupuncture to help release tension stored in your muscles. Focus on emotional release. Don't hide emotions like crying or laughter. Allowing yourself to fully express emotions can release the emotional and physical tension tied to trauma. Rebuild immune function. Support your immune system by reducing stress, eating anti-inflammatory foods, and incorporating movement and relaxation into your daily routine. A healthy immune system is essential for overall trauma recovery. Critical insight. Breaking the cycle of trauma in the body requires a combination of physical, emotional, and mental practices. By releasing tension, strengthening the immune system, and calming the nervous system, trauma survivors can begin to heal both body and mind. Trauma doesn't just live in the mind, it's deeply embedded in the body. From chronic pain to immune dysfunction to tension stored in the muscles, the physical manifestations of trauma can last long after the traumatic event itself. Healing requires addressing both the emotional and physical aspects of trauma, using practices that help release stress stored in the body. How to recognize patterns of generational trauma. Generational trauma is often tricky to spot because it's deeply ingrained in family dynamics and cultural practices. Many families pass down coping mechanisms, beliefs, and behaviors without realizing that these are rooted in unresolved trauma. Recognizing the patterns of generational trauma is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Emotional avoidance. One of the most common signs of generational trauma is emotional avoidance. Families affected by trauma often develop unspoken rules about which emotions are acceptable and which must be suppressed. Anger, grief, or vulnerability may be discouraged, while strength and stoicism are rewarded. If you grew up in a household where expressing emotions was seen as a sign of weakness, this could be a sign of generational trauma. Rigid family roles. Trauma often causes family members to adopt rigid roles. For example, one person may take on the caretaker role while another becomes the black sheep. These roles can be passed down through generations, making it difficult for individuals to break free from their assigned place in the family. Rigid roles limit personal growth and perpetuate unhealthy dynamics. Hypervigilance and anxiety. Families affected by trauma often exhibit hypervigilance, a heightened sense of alertness and anxiety. This may manifest as overprotectiveness, constant worry, or a tendency to anticipate danger even when there's no immediate threat. If you were raised in a family where fear and control were dominant themes, you may be witnessing the long-term effects of generational trauma. Unresolved grief. Trauma can create a culture of unresolved grief within families. If past generations have experienced significant loss, such as war, displacement, or abuse, but have never fully processed their grief, this emotional burden is often passed down. You may notice that specific topics are never discussed, or there's a pervasive sadness or emptiness in the family, even if no current event seems to justify it. Repetitive patterns of abuse. One of the most precise indicators of generational trauma is the repetition of abusive behaviors. Families with a history of abuse, whether physical, emotional, or sexual, often unconsciously pass these patterns down. A parent who experienced abuse may become an abusive figure themselves, even if they vow to be different. Breaking this cycle requires deep self-awareness and intentional healing. Addictive behaviors. Substance abuse and other addictive behaviors are often coping mechanisms that are passed down through generations. If addiction runs in your family, it may be a sign that previous generations were using substances to numb the pain of unresolved trauma. These behaviors create cycles of dependency that are difficult to break without addressing the root cause. Inconsistent boundaries. Families dealing with trauma often struggle with boundaries. Some families may have very loose boundaries, where personal space and privacy are not respected. Others may have overly strict boundaries, where emotional walls are built to protect against vulnerability. Inconsistent boundaries can lead to confusion, mistrust, and dysfunction in relationships. Critical insight. Generational trauma manifests in patterns like emotional avoidance, rigid family roles, hypervigilance, unresolved grief, abuse, addiction, and inconsistent boundaries. Recognizing these patterns within your own family system is the first step toward breaking the cycle and moving toward healing. The role of epigenetics in generational trauma. Understanding the biological basis of generational trauma offers even deeper insight into why specific patterns persist. Epigenetics, the study of how behaviors and environment affect gene expression, shows us that trauma can be passed down emotionally and biologically. How trauma affects gene expression. Trauma can alter the way genes are expressed, meaning that its effects can be passed down to future generations through changes in genetic markers. While DNA itself doesn't change, trauma can trigger chemical changes in the body, specifically, in the way certain genes are turned on or off. These changes can influence how a person's body responds to stress, fear, and emotional regulation. Inherited stress responses. Studies have shown that children and grandchildren of trauma survivors, such as Holocaust survivors or individuals affected by war, exhibit higher levels of stress hormones like cortisol. This suggests that the body's stress response can be heightened due to inherited trauma. As a result, these descendants may be more prone to anxiety, depression, or emotional dysregulation, even if they didn't personally experience the original trauma. The potential for healing. Epigenetics also shows us that healing can occur while trauma is passed down. Just as trauma changes gene expression, healing practices, such as therapy, mindfulness, and emotional regulation, can also positively impact gene expression. This means that breaking the cycle of trauma within one generation can create a ripple healing effect for future generations. Key insight: trauma affects family dynamics and can alter gene expression through epigenetics. Healing practices can also change gene expression, offering hope that the cycle of trauma can be interrupted on both an emotional and biological level. Healing family systems and breaking the chain. Healing from generational trauma requires intentional work. It's not enough to recognize the patterns, you must take active steps to heal family systems and break the chain of inherited trauma. This process can be challenging but essential for individual and collective healing. Acknowledge the trauma. The first step in breaking the cycle is acknowledging the trauma passed down through generations. This means openly talking about family history and recognizing the impact of past events, even if they occurred long before your time. The silence around trauma perpetuates its hold on the family, while acknowledgement allows for the possibility of healing. Seek therapy. Therapy is a crucial tool in healing generational trauma. Family therapy, in particular, can help address unresolved conflicts, emotional wounds, and harmful patterns that have persisted across generations. Trauma-informed therapy can guide families through unpacking past hurts and developing healthier ways to relate to one another. Set new boundaries. Breaking the cycle of trauma often requires setting new boundaries within the family system. This may mean establishing limits on emotional availability, deciding how much contact is healthy with toxic family members, or even cutting ties with individuals who are committed to perpetuating abusive or harmful behaviors. Boundaries protect your emotional well-being and create space for healthier dynamics to emerge. Emotional processing and grief work. Many families with generational trauma have deep-seated grief that has never been fully processed. Engaging in grief work, whether individually or collectively, can help release the emotional weight of past losses. This may involve journaling, therapy, or rituals that allow family members to honor the pain of the past and let it go. Forgiveness and compassion. Forgiveness is a decisive step in breaking the chain of trauma, but it must be approached carefully. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, instead, it's about releasing the hold that past hurts have on you. Cultivating compassion for previous generations who may have been acting out of their own trauma can help foster a sense of peace and closure. Healing through connection. Rebuilding healthy family connections is essential for healing. While some family members may be unwilling or unable to heal, others may be ready to engage with you. Prioritize relationships that are nurturing, supportive, and committed to breaking unhealthy cycles. These connections provide the foundation for a healthier family system. Rewriting family narratives. Families affected by generational trauma often have unspoken narratives, stories about who they are, what they've been through, and what they believe. These narratives may reinforce victimhood, shame, or secrecy. By rewriting these narratives, you can create a new story for your family that acknowledges past trauma but also emphasizes resilience, healing, and growth. Develop emotional literacy. Generational trauma often leaves families emotionally illiterate, unable to express or identify emotions. Developing emotional literacy is a critical component of healing. This means learning to name and process emotions healthily, teaching future generations to express feelings openly, and creating a family culture where emotions are acknowledged and respected. End the silence. One of the most insidious aspects of generational trauma is the silence that surrounds it. Ending the silence means bringing trauma into the open, talking about it honestly, and refusing to let it be an unspoken force that controls your family. This transparency is often uncomfortable initially, but it's essential for healing. Critical insight. Healing family systems requires acknowledgement, therapy, boundary setting, emotional processing, and forgiveness. By breaking the silence, developing emotional literacy, and rewriting family narratives, you can create a new, healthier dynamic for future generations. Breaking trauma patterns for future generations. Breaking the cycle of generational trauma isn't just about healing yourself. It's about preventing the trauma from being passed down to future generations. Even if you don't have children, your healing work creates a ripple effect that can positively influence nieces, nephews, younger siblings, and future family members. Model healthy relationships. Children and younger family members learn by example. By modeling healthy relationships, with boundaries, respect, and emotional openness, you demonstrate healthy family dynamics. This creates a new blueprint for how future generations interact within the family. Teach emotional regulation. One of the most important gifts you can give future generations is the ability to regulate their emotions. Trauma often disrupts this skill, leading to emotional outbursts, withdrawal, or dissociation. Teaching children how to manage their feelings, through mindfulness, breathing exercises, or emotional expression, ensures they have the tools to cope with stress and trauma healthily. Create new traditions. Trauma often disrupts family traditions, turning holidays or gatherings into stressful or painful events. Creating new, healthy traditions can foster a sense of connection and joy within the family. Whether it's a yearly family retreat, a shared gratitude practice, or regular family check-ins, these traditions build a sense of security and trust. Open conversations about mental health. Normalizing conversations about mental health is essential for future generations. Make it clear that seeking help is not a sign of weakness but of strength. Encourage family members to talk openly about their struggles and to seek therapy or support when needed. Prioritize healing and self-care. Demonstrating the importance of self-care and healing sends a solid message for future generations. When they see you taking time for therapy, meditation, rest, and emotional reflection, they learn that prioritizing one's mental and emotional health is a lifelong commitment. Critical insight. Breaking the cycle of trauma for future generations involves modeling healthy relationships, teaching emotional regulation, creating new traditions, and normalizing mental health conversations. The healing work you do today will profoundly impact the emotional well-being of future family members. The impact of epigenetics shows us that while trauma can alter gene expression, so can healing. This means that the work you do to heal yourself has the potential to positively affect future generations, both emotionally and biologically. Healing family systems and breaking the chain of trauma is not easy, but it is deeply rewarding and essential for long-term healing. By choosing to confront and heal generational trauma, you create a new legacy, one rooted in emotional awareness, strength, and connection. Breaking the cycle of trauma can pave the way for a healthier, more vibrant family system for generations to come. Chapter 5. Trauma and Relationships, the Invisible Strain. Trauma doesn't only impact our inner world, it profoundly affects how we connect with others. Relationships, whether romantic, familial, or friendships, can become strained under the weight of unresolved trauma. Even when trauma isn't discussed openly, it influences our attachment patterns, behaviors, and emotional responses in subtle but significant ways. In this chapter, we'll explore how trauma affects attachment styles, the formation of codependency and trauma bonds, and how these dynamics play out in relationships. Trauma's effect on attachment styles. Our ability to form healthy, secure relationships is primarily shaped by our early life experiences, especially our attachment to primary caregivers. When trauma is present, whether it's childhood neglect, abuse, or any form of emotional instability, our attachment style can become maladaptive. Understanding the connection between trauma and attachment styles helps explain why some people struggle with intimacy, trust, and emotional connection. Secure attachment. In an ideal scenario, children form a secure attachment with their caregivers. This occurs when the caregiver is consistently responsive, emotionally available, and nurturing. In adulthood, people with secure attachments tend to have healthy relationships where they can trust others, feel comfortable with intimacy, and manage conflict without excessive anxiety. However, when trauma disrupts this process, other, less secure attachment styles emerge. Anxious attachment. Individuals with an anxious attachment style often have a history of inconsistent caregiving. Trauma can exacerbate this inconsistency, leading to feelings of abandonment and fear of rejection. As adults, those with anxious attachments may seek constant reassurance from their partners and feel an overwhelming fear of being left. They may become clingy, apprehensive about their partner's commitment, or prone to emotional outbursts when they think their needs aren't being met. Their trauma makes it challenging to trust that relationships are stable or safe. Avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment develops when caregivers are emotionally unavailable or dismissive. Trauma, particularly neglect, can reinforce this attachment style. As adults, avoidantly attached individuals tend to distance themselves from intimacy, fearing vulnerability and closeness. They may avoid emotional expression, feel uncomfortable with dependence on others, and shut down emotionally when conflicts arise. Trauma teaches them that relying on others is dangerous, so they prefer to remain emotionally independent. Disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment is perhaps the most deeply affected by trauma. This style arises from a caregiver who is both a source of comfort and fear, often seen in situations of abuse. People with disorganized attachment exhibit erratic behavior in relationships, simultaneously desiring closeness but pushing others away out of fear. They may struggle with intense mood swings, have difficulty trusting others, and often feel caught in a cycle of wanting intimacy but fearing it. Trauma causes them to view relationships as inherently unsafe. Attachment and emotional regulation. Trauma disrupts the ability to regulate emotions, which is why attachment issues are closely tied to emotional dysregulation. Individuals with insecure attachments often experience heightened emotional responses, feeling abandoned, rejected, or unloved even when their partners are present and supportive. This emotional intensity can strain relationships and perpetuate feelings of unworthiness or inadequacy. Key insight. Trauma significantly impacts attachment styles, shaping how individuals interact in relationships. Anxious, avoidant, and disorganized attachment styles are common outcomes of early trauma, leading to emotional dysregulation, difficulty with trust, and struggles with intimacy. Codependency and trauma bonds. Trauma can also lead to the formation of codependent relationships and trauma bonds, where unhealthy patterns of behavior and attachment become deeply ingrained. These relationships are often characterized by emotional enmeshment, a lack of healthy boundaries, and cycles of pain and reconciliation that mirror the dynamics of the original trauma. What is codependency? Codependency occurs when one person in a relationship prioritizes the needs and emotions of the other person over their own, to the detriment of their well-being. In a codependent relationship, one partner may take on the caretaker role, constantly trying to fix or save the other person. Trauma survivors are particularly vulnerable to codependency, as they may have learned early on to suppress their own needs to maintain peace or earn love. Signs of codependency. Common signs of codependency include a lack of boundaries, feeling responsible for another person's emotions, fear of abandonment, and a tendency to prioritize the relationship at all costs, even when it's harmful. Codependent individuals may neglect their own emotional health, often feeling as though they have no identity outside of the relationship. This behavior is rooted in trauma, mainly when survival depends on pleasing or caring for others. Why trauma leads to codependency? Trauma, especially in childhood, teaches people to seek safety through relationships. When caregivers are inconsistent or abusive, children may develop the belief that their worth is tied to their ability to meet others' needs. This often manifests as codependent behavior in adulthood, where individuals believe their value comes from fixing or saving their partner. They may tolerate unhealthy or abusive behavior because they feel responsible for their partner's emotional well-being. Trauma bonds explained. Trauma bonds are emotional attachments that form in relationships marked by cycles of abuse, manipulation, or control. Unlike healthy bonds, trauma bonds are characterized by a deep emotional dependence on the abuser. The person being abused may feel intensely connected to their abuser, often justifying the behavior or believing that they can change them. Trauma bonds are prevalent in relationships where there is intermittent reinforcement, periods of affection or kindness followed by abuse. The cycle of abuse in trauma bonds. Trauma bonds thrive in the cycle of abuse. After an abusive episode, the abuser may offer moments of affection or remorse, temporarily making the relationship feel safe and loving. These moments create a powerful emotional high that keeps the victim attached. Over time, the victim becomes conditioned to stay in the relationship, even when the abuse escalates, because they hold on to the hope of returning to the good moments. This cycle is profoundly damaging and often difficult to break without external support. How trauma bonds mirror childhood trauma. Trauma bonds often mimic the dynamics of early childhood trauma. If a person grew up in an environment where love was intertwined with pain or neglect, they may unconsciously seek out similar dynamics in adult relationships. The familiarity of the pattern makes it feel normal, even though it's harmful. The person may stay in the relationship because they've learned to associate love with suffering. Breaking free from codependency and trauma bonds. Healing from codependency and trauma bonds requires a deep recognition of the unhealthy patterns and the emotional wounds driving them. Therapy is a crucial part of this process, particularly trauma-focused therapy, which helps individuals uncover the root of their codependent behaviors and trauma bonds. Establishing healthy boundaries, rebuilding self-worth, and learning to meet one's emotional needs are essential steps in breaking free from these toxic dynamics. Critical insight. Codependency and trauma bonds are common in relationships affected by trauma. These dynamics involve emotional enmeshment, a lack of boundaries, and cycles of abuse that mirror early trauma. Breaking free requires therapy, self-awareness, and the development of healthy boundaries. Trauma and the fear of abandonment. One of the most pervasive effects of trauma in relationships is the fear of abandonment. Trauma survivors often struggle with an intense, irrational fear that their partner will leave them, even when there's no evidence to suggest this. This fear is deeply rooted in childhood experiences of neglect, loss, or emotional instability. Hypervigilance in relationships. People with a deep-seated fear of abandonment often become hypervigilant in their relationships. They may constantly scan for signs that their partner is losing interest, withdrawing, or planning to leave. This hypervigilance can manifest as jealousy, overanalyzing conversations, or seeking constant reassurance from their partner. Self-sabotage. The fear of abandonment often leads to self-sabotaging behavior. Trauma survivors may push their partners away, test their loyalty, or create conflict as a way of protecting themselves from the potential pain of being abandoned. In their mind, it's better to leave first or create distance than to risk being hurt again. Emotional dependency. Trauma survivors with a fear of abandonment may also develop emotional dependency on their partner. They may rely on their partner for constant emotional validation, reassurance, and safety. While emotional connection is essential in relationships, emotional dependency becomes problematic when one person is unable to function independently of the other. How trauma magnifies the fear of rejection. Trauma survivors often interpret ordinary relationship challenges, such as a partner needing space or time alone, as signs of rejection or abandonment. This can lead to clinginess, possessiveness, or extreme anxiety about the relationship. The fear of rejection becomes magnified because trauma has taught them that abandonment is not only possible but inevitable. Critical insight. Trauma survivors often struggle with the fear of abandonment, leading to hypervigilance, emotional dependency, and self-sabotaging behavior. Understanding and addressing this fear is essential for creating healthier, more secure relationships. Healing trauma in relationships. Healing from trauma in relationships requires self-awareness and a commitment to breaking old patterns. While trauma can profoundly affect attachment styles, lead to codependency, and create trauma bonds, it is possible to heal and create healthy, fulfilling relationships. Therapy for individuals and couples. Therapy is one of the most effective ways to heal relationship trauma. Individual therapy helps trauma survivors process their past experiences, identify maladaptive patterns, and develop healthier ways of relating to others. Couples therapy can be equally beneficial, providing a safe space for both partners to explore how trauma is affecting the relationship and learn strategies for improving communication and emotional intimacy. Setting healthy boundaries. One of the most critical steps in healing relationship trauma is learning to set healthy boundaries. Trauma survivors often struggle with boundaries, either becoming too enmeshed in the relationship or too distant. Setting clear, consistent boundaries helps create a sense of safety and respect within the relationship, allowing both partners to maintain their individuality while emotionally connected. Developing self-worth. Trauma often damages self-worth, leaving individuals unworthy of love or connection. Rebuilding self-worth is essential for creating healthy relationships. This involves recognizing that your value is not dependent on your partner's approval or validation and learning to meet your emotional needs rather than relying solely on your partner. Addressing the root of trauma bonds. To break free from trauma bonds, it's essential to address the underlying trauma that created the bond in the first place. Trauma-focused therapy, such as EMDR or somatic therapy, can help individuals process the pain that keeps them tied to toxic relationships. Once the trauma is healed, the bond weakens, allowing for healthier relationship dynamics to emerge. Mindfulness and emotional regulation. Developing mindfulness and emotional regulation skills can help trauma survivors manage the intense emotions that often arise in relationships. Practices like deep breathing, meditation, or journaling help create a sense of calm and reduce the tendency to react impulsively in emotionally charged situations. This allows for more thoughtful, balanced responses rather than reactive or defensive behaviors. Building trust gradually. For trauma survivors, trust is often a significant barrier in relationships. It's essential to recognize that trust doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing concept. It can be built gradually over time. Taking small steps to open up emotionally, communicate openly, and allow vulnerability can help rebuild trust in relationships that have been affected by trauma. Critical insight. Healing trauma in relationships requires therapy, healthy boundaries, self-worth development, and a commitment to emotional regulation. With the right tools and support, trauma survivors can break free from old patterns and create fulfilling, secure relationships. How trauma impacts intimacy and vulnerability. Intimacy and vulnerability are essential for close, fulfilling relationships, yet trauma often makes these qualities feel threatening or unsafe. Whether the trauma stems from childhood, past relationships, or a singular event, its effects on intimacy and vulnerability can persist for years, creating barriers to authentic connection. Fear of vulnerability. Trauma survivors often develop a deep-seated fear of vulnerability. Opening up emotionally or allowing someone to see your true self can feel dangerous, mainly if past experiences taught you that vulnerability leads to hurt or betrayal. Trauma creates a defense mechanism. If I protect myself, I can't be hurt again. While this might feel like self-preservation, it keeps you from forming deep, trusting relationships. Emotional numbing. Many trauma survivors experience emotional numbing, where they shut down their feelings as a way to cope with the pain. This numbing may have been necessary for survival during the traumatic experience, but it becomes a barrier to intimacy later on. When you can't fully feel or express your emotions, forming a genuine connection with others is challenging. Hypervigilance and distrust. Trauma can lead to hypervigilance, where you are constantly looking for threats. In relationships, this manifests as suspicion or distrust of your partner's intentions, even when they haven't done anything to warrant it. This vigilance makes it hard to relax into intimacy because your brain is always preparing for the worst-case scenario. Sexual intimacy and trauma. Trauma, particularly sexual trauma, has a profound impact on physical intimacy. Survivors of sexual trauma may experience anxiety, fear, or discomfort around sexual activity, even if they are in a loving relationship. They may feel detached or disconnected during sex or struggle with physical touch altogether. This makes it difficult to build intimacy, as the body reacts with fear or withdrawal. Avoidance of closeness. For those with avoidant attachment, often stemming from trauma, the idea of emotional closeness can feel suffocating. They may avoid intimate conversations, shy away from vulnerability, or distance themselves emotionally when the relationship deepens. This avoidance is rooted in the belief that intimacy will lead to emotional pain or loss, so it's safer to maintain distance. The shame barrier. Trauma survivors often carry shame, feeling that their experiences or emotional scars make them unworthy of love. This shame creates a barrier to vulnerability, as it fosters a belief that if someone were to know the real you, they would reject or abandon you. Shame makes it difficult to be honest and open in relationships, leading to superficial connections. Critical insight. Trauma creates a fear of vulnerability and emotional numbing that blocks intimacy. Survivors may struggle with trust, avoid closeness, or carry shame that prevents deep emotional connections, all of which undermine the foundation of healthy relationships. Rebuilding trust after trauma. Trust is one of the first casualties of trauma, especially if the trauma involves betrayal or violation of boundaries. Rebuilding trust, whether in oneself, others, or a partner, is a gradual process that requires patience, intentional effort, and a willingness to take risks. Once broken, trust cannot be restored overnight, but it is possible to rebuild it over time with the right approach. Self-trust as the foundation. Rebuilding trust begins with learning to trust yourself again. Trauma often leaves survivors doubting their instincts, second-guessing their decisions, or feeling ashamed of how they responded to the trauma. Before you can rebuild trust with others, restoring self-trust is crucial. This means recognizing that your survival mechanisms, emotional shutdown, anger, or withdrawal, were valid responses to an overwhelming situation. Trusting yourself involves reclaiming your intuition, validating your feelings, and forgiving yourself for any perceived shortcomings. Taking small steps. Rebuilding trust requires small, consistent steps rather than grand gestures. Trauma survivors may feel overwhelmed by the idea of fully trusting again, but trust can be rebuilt incrementally. This could mean gradually sharing more about your thoughts or feelings with a partner, asking for support when needed, or allowing yourself to be vulnerable in controlled, safe situations. Each small step reinforces the idea that trust is possible without overwhelming the nervous system. Open communication. Clear, open communication is essential when rebuilding trust in relationships. Trauma survivors may be afraid to voice their concerns or fears, but communicating openly with your partner about your triggers, needs, and boundaries is critical. Honest conversations create a foundation for trust by ensuring both partners understand each other's emotional landscape. This also allows the survivor to feel seen and heard, which reinforces safety in the relationship. Establishing boundaries. Trauma often involves a violation of boundaries, leaving survivors feeling unsafe or unprotected. Rebuilding trust requires the establishment of clear, healthy boundaries. Boundaries are not about keeping people out but creating safe spaces where both partners can thrive. Discussing and maintaining boundaries in a relationship helps trauma survivors regain a sense of control, which is critical to rebuilding trust. Patience and time. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. Both the trauma survivor and their partner need to practice patience and allow for the gradual restoration of trust. There will be setbacks, moments of fear, and possibly even lapses in judgment. What matters is the commitment to keep moving forward, to address issues as they arise, and to stay engaged in the process. Over time, trust can deepen as both partners continue to show up for one another. Seeking professional support. Sometimes, trauma has such a profound effect on trust that professional support becomes necessary. Trauma-informed therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, can help trauma survivors unpack the fears and mistrust rooted in past experiences. Therapy can also provide a safe environment for couples to explore trust issues and develop strategies for moving forward together. Forgiveness as part of healing. Forgiveness plays a complex role in rebuilding trust. It's important to note that forgiveness isn't about excusing harmful behavior or pretending that the trauma didn't happen. Instead, forgiveness is about letting go of past events hold on your ability to trust the present. Forgiving yourself, in particular, is a crucial part of this process. Self-forgiveness allows you to move beyond guilt or shame and trust your instincts and decisions again. Building emotional safety. Trust is deeply tied to emotional safety. Trauma survivors need to feel that they can express their emotions, whether sadness, anger, fear, or joy, without being judged or dismissed. Building emotional safety involves creating a relationship environment where both partners feel free to express themselves authentically. This safety is reinforced when both people practice active listening, empathy, and validation. Celebrating progress. Rebuilding trust is a journey, and it's important to celebrate progress, even if it feels small. Acknowledging the steps you've taken, opening up more, setting a boundary, or taking a risk in the relationship, reinforces the belief that trust is possible. Celebrating these moments helps build confidence in forming secure, trusting relationships over time. Critical insight. Rebuilding trust after trauma requires self-trust, open communication, patience, and a commitment to healthy boundaries. With time, small steps, and professional support, trauma survivors can rebuild trust and create emotionally safe, supportive relationships. The intersection of intimacy, vulnerability, and trust. The relationship between intimacy, vulnerability, and trust is deeply intertwined. Trauma disrupts all three, making it hard to experience closeness without fear. However, healing in relationships often starts with rebuilding trust, which opens the door to vulnerability and, eventually, intimacy. Vulnerability requires trust. True vulnerability can only occur when there is trust. Trauma survivors often avoid vulnerability because they fear being hurt again, but as trust is rebuilt, vulnerability becomes possible. Being vulnerable, sharing fears, dreams, and emotions, without fear of judgment or rejection fosters deeper intimacy. For trauma survivors, allowing themselves to be vulnerable again is a profound act of courage. Intimacy is more than physical closeness. Intimacy is often misunderstood as physical closeness, but it's much more. Emotional intimacy, feeling safe, understood, and connected on a deep emotional level, is equally, if not more, important. Trauma survivors may struggle with both forms of intimacy, but healing begins with emotional safety, which can then extend to physical closeness as trust and vulnerability grows. Trust is the foundation. Without trust, neither intimacy nor vulnerability can thrive. Trust provides the emotional safety necessary for individuals to let down their guard, be vulnerable, and experience genuine closeness. Rebuilding trust in the aftermath of trauma isn't easy, but it is possible. It requires consistent effort, open communication, and the willingness to address the impact of trauma on the relationship. Critical insight. Trust is the foundation upon which vulnerability and intimacy are built. Rebuilding trust after trauma opens the path to deeper connection, allowing emotional safety, vulnerability, and intimacy to flourish in relationships. Trauma leaves deep scars on our capacity for intimacy, vulnerability, and trust. The fear of rejection, emotional numbness, and hyper-independence that trauma survivors often experience create significant barriers to forming deep, meaningful relationships. However, healing is possible. By rebuilding trust, starting with self-trust, gradually opening up to vulnerability and establishing healthy boundaries, trauma survivors can overcome these barriers and cultivate secure, emotionally fulfilling relationships. Chapter 6. Coping Mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are the strategies we use to manage stress, pain, and emotional turmoil. For trauma survivors, coping mechanisms are often a critical part of their emotional survival. However, not all coping mechanisms are created equal. Some help individuals heal and grow, while others mask the pain and cause further harm. In this chapter, we'll explore the difference between healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, delve into the role of emotional numbing as a trauma response, and examine how substance abuse and addiction often become destructive coping strategies. Healthy versus unhealthy coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are our way of handling distressing emotions and experiences. While some mechanisms promote resilience and healing, others can deepen emotional wounds, prolong suffering, and create new problems. Distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms is essential for trauma recovery. Healthy coping mechanisms. Healthy coping mechanisms support long-term emotional stability and well-being. They are tools that help individuals process their emotions, manage stress, and engage in behaviors that contribute to personal growth and healing. Mindfulness and meditation. One of the most potent healthy coping mechanisms is mindfulness, the practice of staying present and aware of one's emotions without judgment. Meditation helps individuals calm their nervous systems and gain insight into their thoughts and feelings. By staying grounded in the present, trauma survivors can reduce anxiety and avoid being overwhelmed by painful memories. Exercise and movement. Physical activity is another essential healthy coping mechanism. Exercise releases endorphins, which naturally elevate mood and reduce stress. For trauma survivors, movement-based practices like yoga, running, or dancing can help release tension stored in the body and improve emotional well-being. Regular physical activity also enhances sleep and promotes a stronger mind-body connection. Creative expression. Engaging in creative activities, such as drawing, painting, writing, or playing music, provides an outlet for difficult emotions. Art can be a powerful way to express feelings that are hard to articulate verbally. Creativity allows individuals to explore their inner world safely and non-judgmentally, fostering healing and self-discovery. Journaling. Journaling is another effective healthy coping strategy. Writing down thoughts and feelings provides clarity, helps process trauma, and offers a safe space to express complex emotions. Journaling can also help track progress and identify patterns of thought that contribute to distress, making it easier to challenge and reframe negative beliefs. Therapy and support groups. Seeking help through therapy or attending support groups is a cornerstone of healthy coping. Trauma-informed therapy provides professional guidance in processing emotions, understanding triggers, and developing strategies for managing distress. Support groups offer a sense of community, reminding trauma survivors that they are not alone in their journey. Setting boundaries. Establishing and maintaining boundaries is an essential healthy coping mechanism. Trauma survivors often struggle with saying no or setting limits, which can lead to emotional exhaustion and further harm. Learning to prioritize one's needs and protect one's emotional space fosters self-respect and healing. Self-compassion. Self-compassion is an often overlooked but vital healthy coping mechanism. Trauma can leave individuals feeling broken or unworthy, but practicing self-compassion, treating oneself with kindness during moments of pain, helps counter these feelings. Instead of criticizing oneself for struggling, self-compassion promotes patience, care, and understanding. Critical insight. Healthy coping mechanisms include mindfulness, physical activity, creative expression, therapy, and setting boundaries. These strategies promote emotional resilience, self-compassion, and long-term healing, providing trauma survivors with the tools to manage their pain constructively. Unhealthy coping mechanisms. Unhealthy coping mechanisms may provide temporary relief but ultimately worsen emotional distress and prolong recovery. These behaviors often suppress or avoid painful feelings rather than addressing the root cause, leading to destructive cycles. Avoidance. One of the most common unhealthy coping mechanisms is avoidance, the tendency to ignore or deny distressing emotions. Trauma survivors may avoid triggers, painful memories, or difficult conversations in an attempt to protect themselves. While avoidance may seem like a way to maintain emotional stability, it prevents healing by keeping unresolved trauma buried and unaddressed. Overworking or hyperproductivity. Some individuals cope with trauma by becoming workaholics or excessively focusing on productivity. By immersing themselves in tasks or work, they attempt to distract themselves from painful emotions. However, this coping strategy can lead to burnout, strained relationships, and further emotional numbness. Perfectionism. Perfectionism often arises as a defense mechanism in response to trauma. Individuals may try to control their environment or achieve unrealistic standards to avoid feelings of failure or vulnerability. This need for control is rooted in fear, and while perfectionism provides a temporary sense of stability, it perpetuates anxiety and stress in the long run. Emotional suppression. Many trauma survivors learn to suppress their emotions as a way of coping. This involves pushing down feelings of sadness, anger, or fear instead of allowing them to be felt and processed. Suppressing emotions can lead to increased anxiety, depression, and physical symptoms like headaches or stomach issues. Risky behaviors. Engaging in risky behaviors, such as reckless driving, unsafe sex, or excessive gambling, is another unhealthy way some trauma survivors cope. These behaviors can provide an adrenaline rush or temporary distraction but often lead to further emotional and physical harm. Self-isolation. While some alone time can be healthy, trauma survivors may engage in self-isolation to avoid connection with others. This withdrawal from social interactions reinforces feelings of loneliness and alienation, making it challenging to build support networks and maintain healthy relationships. Critical insight. Unhealthy coping mechanisms, including avoidance, overworking, perfectionism, emotional suppression, and risky behaviors, may temporarily numb the pain but ultimately prevent healing. Recognizing and replacing these patterns is critical to trauma recovery. Emotional numbing. A common response to trauma. One of the most frequent trauma responses is emotional numbing, a defense mechanism that blunts both positive and negative emotions. Emotional numbing serves as a way to survive overwhelming experiences but often lingers long after the traumatic event has passed, disrupting relationships, emotional health, and daily life. What is emotional numbing? Emotional numbing occurs when an individual shuts down their emotional responses to avoid feeling pain. This can manifest as a sense of detachment, flatness, or indifference to things that used to evoke strong feelings. Trauma survivors who experience emotional numbing often describe feeling like they are living in a fog or disconnected from the world around them. How it develops. Emotional numbing is a survival strategy. During or after a traumatic event, the brain can become overwhelmed by fear, grief, or shock. To protect itself, the brain turns off its emotional responses to avoid becoming overwhelmed by pain. While this response can be helpful in the short term, it becomes problematic when it persists long after the trauma has ended. The impact on relationships. Emotional numbing has a profound effect on relationships. Survivors may find connecting with their partners, children, or friends challenging. They may struggle to feel empathy, love, or joy, leaving their loved ones confused or distant. The inability to express or experience emotions can create barriers to intimacy and vulnerability. Numbing positive and negative emotions. Emotional numbing doesn't just block out painful emotions, it affects all feelings, including positive ones. Trauma survivors may find it difficult to experience pleasure, excitement, or joy. Emotional numbness can make it hard to fully engage, even in moments that should bring happiness, such as celebrations or time with loved ones. Physical symptoms of numbing. Emotional numbing often leads to physical symptoms. Survivors may feel tired, lethargic, or physically disconnected from their bodies. They might also experience difficulty concentrating, making decisions, or remembering important details. Over time, emotional numbing can contribute to depression, chronic fatigue, and other health issues. Healing emotional numbing. Overcoming emotional numbing requires gently reconnecting with one's emotions. Mindfulness practices, such as deep breathing or body scans, can help survivors become more attuned to their feelings and physical sensations. Therapy, especially somatic therapy or trauma-informed therapy, is crucial in assisting survivors in processing their emotions in a safe and controlled environment. Allowing oneself to gradually experience emotions, even in small doses, helps break down the barriers that numbing creates. Critical insight. Emotional numbing is a survival mechanism that blunts positive and negative emotions. While it protects against overwhelming pain, it also creates emotional disconnection and physical symptoms. Healing requires reconnecting with emotions in a safe, mindful way. Substance abuse and addiction as coping mechanisms. For many trauma survivors, substance abuse becomes a way to cope with emotional pain. Drugs and alcohol offer temporary relief, numbing the distressing emotions or memories associated with trauma. However, this reliance on substances often leads to addiction, creating a cycle of dependency that further complicates the healing process. Why trauma leads to substance abuse? Trauma survivors often turn to substances to escape overwhelming emotions. Alcohol, drugs, or prescription medications can provide a sense of relief, dulling the intensity of flashbacks, anxiety, or emotional pain. For some, substances serve as a way to forget the trauma altogether, allowing for temporary freedom from the weight of their experiences. The temporary relief trap. While substances may offer temporary relief, they do not address the root of the trauma. Over time, the body and mind become dependent on the substance, requiring more to achieve the same numbing effect. This leads to addiction, where the survivor feels unable to function without the substance. As the addiction deepens, the trauma remains unprocessed, and the survivor's emotional and physical health continues to deteriorate. Substances as emotional suppressants. Substances, particularly alcohol or sedatives, act as emotional suppressants. They prevent trauma survivors from fully experiencing their emotions, delaying the healing process. In the short term, this may feel like a relief, but in the long term, it exacerbates emotional dysregulation, making it even harder to cope without substances. Substance abuse and co-occurring disorders. Substance abuse often occurs alongside other mental health conditions, such as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. These co-occurring disorders can create a vicious cycle where untreated trauma fuels substance use, and substance use worsens the symptoms of trauma-related mental health issues. Breaking free from substance dependency. Healing from trauma-related substance abuse requires a comprehensive approach. Trauma-informed addiction therapy is crucial, as it addresses both the trauma and the substance use simultaneously. Without treating the trauma, the underlying cause of the addiction, recovery is unlikely to last. Support groups, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous, NA, can provide community and accountability, helping survivors break free from the cycle of addiction. Alternative coping mechanisms. Replacing substances with healthier coping mechanisms is essential for long-term recovery. Mindfulness practices, therapy, exercise, and creative expression offer healthy alternatives to substance use, helping trauma survivors process their emotions without turning to harmful behaviors. Learning to sit with discomfort, rather than numbing it, is a critical skill in overcoming addiction. Critical insight. Substance abuse often becomes a coping mechanism for trauma survivors seeking to numb emotional pain. While substances provide temporary relief, they lead to addiction and prevent healing. Recovery requires trauma-informed therapy and replacing substances with healthier coping mechanisms. Dissociation. When the mind disconnects from the body. One of the most common yet misunderstood responses to trauma is dissociation, a psychological mechanism that creates a sense of detachment between the mind and body. Dissociation can manifest in various forms, from mild daydreaming to more severe experiences of feeling disconnected from reality. What is dissociation? Dissociation occurs when the mind feels overwhelmed by a traumatic experience and disconnects from the body or surroundings to protect itself from emotional pain. This defense mechanism allows trauma survivors to escape the immediate distress of their circumstances, but when it becomes chronic, dissociation can interfere with daily functioning and relationships. The spectrum of dissociation. Dissociation exists on a spectrum. On the mild end, it might involve spacing out during a stressful moment or feeling emotionally numb. In more severe cases, trauma survivors may experience dissociative amnesia, where they cannot remember important details of the traumatic event, or depersonalization, where they feel disconnected from their body or like they are observing themselves from the outside. Derealization, where the world feels unreal or dreamlike, can also occur in response to trauma. Why dissociation happens? Trauma overwhelms the brain's capacity to process intense emotions. Dissociation acts as a shield, allowing individuals to distance themselves from unbearable memories or feelings. For people who have experienced ongoing trauma, such as childhood abuse, dissociation becomes a frequent and automatic response, a way to survive emotionally when there is no way to escape physically. The impact of dissociation on life. While dissociation protects individuals from the immediate pain of trauma, it creates long-term challenges. Dissociated individuals often struggle to feel fully present in their lives. They may have difficulty maintaining relationships, experience memory gaps, or feel detached from their emotions. This detachment can prevent trauma survivors from processing their pain, as they are disconnected from the feelings they need to work through to heal. Healing dissociation. Reconnecting the mind and body is crucial to healing from dissociation. Somatic therapies, which focus on body awareness, can help trauma survivors ground themselves in the present moment. Mindfulness practices that encourage paying attention to physical sensations and emotions can gradually reduce dissociative episodes. Trauma-informed therapy is also critical, as it provides a safe space for individuals to explore their feelings without becoming overwhelmed. Critical insight. Dissociation is a protective mechanism that helps individuals cope with overwhelming trauma. While it serves a vital role in emotional survival, it can become a barrier to healing by creating disconnection from the body and emotions. Somatic therapies, mindfulness, and trauma-informed therapy are essential for reducing dissociative episodes and fostering reconnection. How avoidance perpetuates trauma. Avoidance is a natural response to trauma, but it is also one of the most damaging coping mechanisms because it prevents healing. Whether through emotional suppression, denial, or avoiding triggers, trauma survivors often rely on avoidance to steer clear of painful feelings or memories. However, this tactic only serves to reinforce the trauma and delay recovery. What is avoidance? Avoidance means steering clear of anything that might trigger traumatic memories or emotions. This can include avoiding places, people, situations, or conversations that remind the survivor of the trauma. While avoidance may provide short-term relief, it intensifies emotional distress over time by preventing the survivor from processing and integrating their experiences. Emotional avoidance. One form of avoidance is the emotional avoidance of feelings like sadness, anger, or fear. Trauma survivors may numb themselves emotionally or distract themselves with work, entertainment, or other activities to avoid feeling vulnerable. Emotional avoidance blocks the natural process of grieving and healing, causing unresolved emotions to fester beneath the surface. Behavioral avoidance. Trauma survivors often engage in behavioral avoidance to shield themselves from reminders of their trauma. They might avoid social gatherings, isolate themselves from others, or refuse to engage in activities they once enjoyed. While behavioral avoidance provides a temporary sense of safety, it gradually shrinks the survivor's world, increasing isolation and anxiety. How avoidance reinforces trauma. Avoidance keeps trauma unresolved because it doesn't allow the survivor to confront or process their pain. By avoiding triggers or painful emotions, the trauma remains unhealed, leading to a cycle of heightened anxiety and emotional distress. Over time, avoidance makes it harder to face the trauma, creating a more intense fear of revisiting the painful experience. Breaking the cycle of avoidance. Breaking the avoidance cycle requires gently confronting the trauma in small, manageable steps. Exposure therapy is one technique where individuals gradually face their triggers in a controlled and supportive environment, helping them desensitize to the trauma over time. Mindfulness is also helpful, encouraging survivors to stay present with their emotions instead of avoiding them. Practicing self-compassion throughout this process is essential, allowing for setbacks and progress at a safe pace. Critical insight. Avoidance perpetuates trauma by preventing emotional processing and reinforcing fear. While avoidance may feel protective, it ultimately prolongs suffering. Facing trauma gradually, through techniques like exposure therapy and mindfulness, allows for healing and emotional integration. The importance of therapy in addressing trauma. One of the most crucial components of trauma recovery is therapy. Trauma-informed therapy offers survivors a structured, supportive environment where they can process their experiences, learn coping mechanisms, and heal holistically. While many trauma survivors attempt to manage on their own, professional guidance is often necessary for deep, lasting recovery. Why therapy matters. Therapy provides a safe, non-judgmental space where trauma survivors can explore their emotions, memories, and beliefs. Trauma often leads to distorted thinking patterns, such as self-blame, guilt, or fear of vulnerability, that can prevent healing. Therapists help survivors untangle these thoughts, offering new perspectives and tools to cope with distress. Trauma-informed therapy. Not all therapy is created equal, especially regarding trauma. Trauma-informed therapy is a specialized approach that recognizes the unique needs of trauma survivors. This therapy focuses on safety, trust, and empowerment, ensuring the survivor feels supported rather than re-traumatized during the therapeutic process. Trauma-informed therapists are trained to handle the intense emotions and memories that may arise in sessions, guiding survivors through their recovery with care and sensitivity. Types of therapy for trauma. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT is a widely used therapeutic approach that helps individuals identify and challenge distorted thinking patterns. In trauma recovery, CBT focuses on breaking down unhelpful beliefs, e.g., I am to blame for what happened, and replacing them with healthier, more realistic thoughts. CBT also teaches coping skills for managing anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. EMDR is a therapy specifically designed for trauma survivors. It involves recalling traumatic memories while engaging in bilateral stimulation, e.g., moving the eyes from side to side. This process helps the brain reprocess the traumatic memory, reducing its emotional intensity and allowing survivors to integrate it more peacefully. Somatic therapy. Somatic therapy focuses on the mind-body connection, helping trauma survivors release tension and trauma stored in the body. This therapy benefits those who experience dissociation, encouraging grounding and reconnection with physical sensations. Group therapy and support. Group therapy and support groups offer an additional layer of healing by connecting trauma survivors with others who share similar experiences. Group settings provide a sense of community, helping survivors realize they are not alone. Support groups can also offer practical advice, emotional support, and validation, which is especially helpful for those who feel isolated or misunderstood. The therapeutic relationship. One of the most healing aspects of therapy is the relationship between the therapist and the client. Trauma survivors often struggle with trust, but a supportive therapeutic relationship can serve as a model for healthy, trusting interactions. Over time, this relationship helps survivors build self-trust and develop the emotional skills necessary for deeper connections in their personal lives. Critical insight. Therapy is a vital tool in trauma recovery, providing the structure and support necessary to process difficult emotions and memories. Trauma-informed therapy, whether through CBT, EMDR, or somatic therapy, offers targeted interventions for healing, while group therapy fosters community and mutual support. Positive coping mechanisms. Developing positive coping mechanisms is essential for long-term trauma recovery. While unhealthy coping strategies may provide temporary relief, they often lead to further emotional or physical harm. In contrast, positive coping mechanisms foster resilience, emotional regulation, and personal growth, empowering survivors to navigate their trauma healthier. Mindfulness and grounding. Mindfulness helps trauma survivors stay present, reducing anxiety by focusing on the here and now. Grounding techniques, such as deep breathing, focusing on physical sensations, or observing the environment, are practical tools for managing overwhelming emotions. These practices help individuals stay connected to their bodies and surroundings, especially during moments of emotional intensity. Exercise and movement. Physical activity is one of the most effective ways to reduce stress and promote emotional well-being. Exercise releases endorphins, improves mood, and reduces tension stored in the body. Practices like yoga or walking can also meditate, helping survivors reconnect with their bodies calmly and mindfully. Creative expression. Trauma survivors often struggle to express their feelings verbally. Creative expression, whether through art, music, writing, or dance, offers a way to process emotions nonverbally. Engaging in creative activities allows for exploring deep feelings in a safe, structured way. Self-compassion and self-care. Self-compassion is a critical positive coping mechanism. Trauma survivors often blame themselves for their experiences or feel unworthy of care. Practicing self-compassion means treating oneself with kindness and understanding, especially during moments of pain. Self-care routines, such as taking time for relaxation, maintaining healthy sleep habits, and engaging in activities that bring joy reinforce self-worth and emotional resilience. Support networks. Building and maintaining a solid support network is essential for trauma recovery. Having people you trust, whether friends, family, or support group members, provides emotional support and a sense of belonging. Positive social interactions foster healing by offering comfort, validation, and connection. Cognitive reframing. Cognitive reframing shifts negative thought patterns to more balanced, positive ones. Trauma survivors may struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, or fear, but by actively challenging these thoughts and replacing them with healthier perspectives, they can foster emotional healing. Cognitive reframing is often used in CBT to help survivors change the way they perceive their trauma and themselves. Critical insight. Developing positive coping mechanisms, such as mindfulness, exercise, creative expression, self-compassion, and support networks, empowers trauma survivors to manage their emotions constructively and build resilience. These tools promote long-term healing and personal growth. Chapter 7. Healing the wounds. Trauma recovery is not a linear process. It involves several stages, each critical to healing. The path from surviving trauma to thriving after it is complex and often marked by setbacks, but ultimately leads to emotional resilience and freedom. In this chapter, we will explore the stages of trauma recovery, examine why acceptance is the first crucial step toward healing, and understand how forgiveness, both of oneself and others, is a powerful tool in trauma recovery. The stages of trauma recovery. The process of healing from trauma can be broken down into stages. While every person's journey is unique, understanding these stages helps trauma survivors identify where they are in their recovery and what they need to move forward. Stage 1. Safety and stabilization. The first stage of trauma recovery is focused on establishing a sense of safety. Trauma survivors often feel destabilized, overwhelmed by emotions, or constantly on edge. This stage involves creating a safe environment, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Physical safety. For some survivors, especially those who have experienced abuse or violence, creating a physically safe environment is the immediate priority. This might mean leaving an abusive relationship, moving to a safe location, or setting up protective measures to feel secure. Emotional safety. Emotional safety involves learning to regulate overwhelming emotions. Trauma survivors often experience intense feelings of fear, sadness, or anger, and this stage requires developing coping mechanisms to manage those emotions without becoming overwhelmed. Working with a therapist or engaging in grounding exercises can help stabilize emotions. Building trust. During this stage, survivors may also need to rebuild their ability to trust themselves and others. Trust is often shattered by trauma, especially when the traumatic event involves betrayal or violation. Relearning how to trust starts with small steps, including trusting one's instincts and gradually opening up to supportive relationships. Stage 2. Remembrance and mourning. The second stage of trauma recovery involves remembering and mourning the trauma. This stage is problematic because it requires confronting the traumatic events head-on, allowing yourself to process the emotions and memories you may have been avoiding. Processing the trauma. In this stage, survivors begin to piece together their memories of the trauma. This might involve therapy, journaling, or simply discussing the experience with a trusted person. Processing the trauma allows survivors to better understand what happened and how it has affected them. Mourning the loss. Trauma often involves profound loss, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the loss of safety, or the loss of a sense of self. Mourning is an essential part of recovery, as it allows survivors to grieve what they've lost. Grief is not something to be rushed or avoided. It's a natural and necessary step in healing. Emotional release. This stage may also involve emotional release. Trauma survivors often carry suppressed feelings, anger, sadness, or even relief, that need to be expressed. Allowing yourself to feel and express these emotions is crucial for moving forward. Stage 3. Reconnection and integration. The final stage of trauma recovery is about reconnection with yourself, your community, and your future. It's about integrating the trauma into your life in a way that allows you to move forward, not as a victim of your past, but as someone who has grown stronger because of it. Reconnecting with yourself. Trauma often creates a disconnect between survivors and their bodies or emotions. Reconnection involves rebuilding that relationship with yourself, learning to trust your instincts, rediscovering your passions, and nurturing your physical and emotional health. Rebuilding relationships. As survivors heal, they often begin to rebuild relationships with others. This might involve reconnecting with family and friends or forming new relationships. Trust and vulnerability, which may have been damaged by trauma, start to return, allowing for deeper connections. Integration of the trauma. The trauma does not disappear but becomes integrated into the survivor's life in a way that no longer dominates their identity. Survivors find meaning in their experiences, often discovering resilience, strength, and new perspectives they hadn't realized before. Critical insight. Trauma recovery happens in stages, from safety and stabilization to remembrance and mourning, and finally to reconnection and integration. Each stage is crucial, and progress is not linear, but understanding these stages provides a framework for healing. Acceptance, the first step toward healing. Acceptance is a pivotal moment in trauma recovery. It's impossible to truly heal without acceptance because one remains trapped in denial, resistance, or avoidance. Acceptance doesn't mean condoning what happened or giving up on justice. It means acknowledging the reality of the trauma and deciding to move forward from it. What does acceptance mean? Acceptance means fully recognizing the trauma's impact on your life, emotionally, physically, and mentally. It means allowing yourself to feel the pain without minimizing or denying it. It also means accepting that healing is a process and that the trauma may continue to affect you in ways you can't control. Letting go of resistance. Many trauma survivors initially resist accepting their trauma. They may downplay the event, deny its severity, or convince themselves they should move on without fully processing it. This resistance is often a defense mechanism, protecting the survivor from emotional overwhelm. However, healing only begins when you stop fighting the reality of what happened and start allowing yourself to process the experience. Why acceptance is not defeat? Acceptance is not the same as defeat. It doesn't mean resigning yourself to the trauma or becoming defined by it. On the contrary, acceptance is an empowering act, recognizing that while you can't change the past, you can shape your future. It allows you to stop expending energy on denial and instead focus on healing and growth. Acceptance of your emotions. Trauma often brings with it a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, guilt, shame, and fear. Acceptance means allowing yourself to feel these emotions without judgment. It's about acknowledging that these feelings are valid responses to trauma, and you don't have to push them away to begin healing. The path forward after acceptance. Once you accept the trauma and its impact, you can focus on the steps needed to heal. Acceptance allows you to stop trying to control the uncontrollable and start taking meaningful actions, seeking therapy, developing coping strategies, or engaging in self-care. Critical insight. Acceptance is the crucial first step in trauma recovery. It means acknowledging the full impact of the trauma without denial or minimization. Acceptance is not resignation. It is an empowering moment that allows survivors to move forward with healing and growth. The role of forgiveness in trauma healing. Forgiveness plays a complex role in trauma healing. For some, forgiving someone who caused harm feels impossible or even wrong. For others, forgiveness is an essential part of their recovery. Whether it's forgiving someone else or forgiving yourself, forgiveness offers an opportunity for release and freedom. Self-forgiveness. Trauma survivors often carry immense guilt or shame, even when the trauma is entirely out of their control. Self-forgiveness is an essential part of healing because it allows survivors to let go of the self-blame that keeps them trapped in pain. Guilt and shame. Many survivors feel guilty for not having done something differently during the traumatic event. They may think, "If only I had acted sooner," or "I should have seen it coming." These thoughts are fueled by the mistaken belief that they have control over an uncontrollable situation. Self-forgiveness involves recognizing that you did the best you could under the circumstances. Letting go of self-blame. Forgiving yourself means acknowledging that you were not responsible for the trauma. It means releasing the unrealistic expectations you may have placed on yourself and accepting that you are human, vulnerable, and deserving of compassion. Rebuilding self-worth. Forgiveness of oneself is also about rebuilding a sense of self-worth. Trauma often leaves survivors feeling broken or unworthy of love and care. Self-forgiveness reminds you that you deserve healing, happiness, and peace. Forgiving others. Forgiving others, especially those who caused the trauma, can be one of the most challenging healing aspects. It's important to note that forgiveness is not about excusing the harm done or letting the person off the hook. Instead, it's about releasing the trauma's hold on you. What forgiveness is and isn't. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It also doesn't mean reconciling with the person who caused the harm, especially if they remain unsafe. Forgiveness is about letting go of the resentment, anger, or desire for revenge that continues to affect your mental and emotional well-being. Reclaiming your power. Forgiveness is an act of reclaiming your power. When you hold on to anger or bitterness, the person who caused the harm continues to have control over your emotions. By choosing forgiveness, you free yourself from their influence and allow yourself to focus on your healing, not on their actions. When forgiveness isn't necessary, it's important to acknowledge that forgiveness is a personal choice, and not everyone will need to forgive their perpetrator to heal. Some trauma survivors may find peace through acceptance and healing practices without forgiving the person who caused their trauma. This is equally valid. Healing has no one-size-fits-all solution, Survivors must choose what feels right for them. Critical insight. Forgiveness, whether of oneself or others, plays a significant role in trauma healing. Self-forgiveness allows survivors to release guilt and shame, while forgiving others can offer emotional freedom from the hold of the trauma. However, forgiveness is not mandatory, and each survivor must find healing. The importance of patience and self-compassion in healing. Healing from trauma is a long journey, and it's crucial to approach it with patience and self-compassion. Trauma survivors often feel frustrated by how long recovery takes or feel pressured to move on quickly. However, healing cannot be rushed, and showing yourself compassion along the way is essential for long-term recovery. Patience with yourself. Trauma recovery is not linear, and setbacks are a natural part of the process. There will be moments of progress, but there will also be times when emotions resurface or old coping mechanisms reappear. Patience means understanding that healing happens in waves and allowing yourself the time to go through each phase. Self-compassion as a healing tool. Self-compassion involves treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a struggling close friend. Trauma survivors often blame themselves for their feelings or believe they should be over it by now. Practicing self-compassion reminds you that healing is hard work and that you deserve grace and support. Celebrating small wins. Celebrating small victories in the healing process is essential. These moments matter whether it's opening up about your trauma for the first time, setting a boundary, or feeling a sense of relief after a therapy session. Recognizing your progress, no matter how small, reinforces your healing ability. Critical insight. Patience and self-compassion are vital elements of trauma recovery. Healing is not linear, and setbacks are part of the process. Practicing self-compassion allows survivors to approach their recovery with kindness and understanding, fostering long-term healing. Finding purpose and meaning after trauma. Trauma can leave individuals feeling broken, hopeless, and lost. Yet, for many survivors, the healing process opens the door to discovering a more profound sense of purpose and meaning in life. This stage of recovery shifts the focus from what was lost to what can be gained from the experience. Transforming pain into growth. One of the most powerful outcomes of healing is the ability to transform pain into growth. While trauma brings immense suffering, it also presents an opportunity to grow emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. Survivors often discover new strengths, resilience, and insight they didn't realize they had. Confronting and overcoming trauma reveals an inner fortitude that can be applied to other areas of life. Finding meaning in adversity. Trauma survivors may struggle to find meaning in the senselessness of their suffering. But in many cases, meaning is not found in the event itself but in how one responds to it. Finding purpose can mean using the lessons learned from trauma to help others, advocating for change, or pursuing a passion that brings fulfillment. The search for meaning is personal and different for everyone, but it often leads to a renewed sense of direction. Post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth describes the positive psychological changes that occur as a result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. Trauma survivors may develop a deeper appreciation for life, stronger relationships, greater personal strength, and new possibilities or goals they hadn't considered before. Post-traumatic growth isn't about dismissing the pain but about recognizing that growth and transformation can arise from even the darkest experiences. Creating a new narrative. Trauma can dominate one's sense of identity, making it difficult to see oneself as anything other than a victim. However, finding meaning after trauma involves creating a new narrative, one in which the individual is no longer defined by what happened to them but by how they choose to move forward. This new narrative allows survivors to reclaim their sense of self, incorporating the lessons of the past while focusing on the possibilities of the future. Helping others. Many trauma survivors find purpose in helping others who are going through similar experiences. Whether through volunteering, advocacy, or mentorship, helping others can be incredibly healing. It allows survivors to use their own experiences as a source of support and strength for others, turning their pain into a force for good. Critical insight. Finding purpose and meaning after trauma is a transformative part of healing. It involves transforming pain into growth, embracing post-traumatic growth, and creating a new narrative that allows survivors to move beyond their trauma and toward a life of fulfillment and resilience. Rebuilding trust in yourself and others. One of the most profound impacts of trauma is the loss of trust in oneself, trust in others, and trust in the world as a safe and predictable place. Rebuilding this trust is essential for moving forward in life, as it forms the foundation for healthy relationships, decision-making, and emotional security. Rebuilding self-trust. Trauma can shatter self-trust, leaving survivors doubting their instincts, choices, and abilities. Rebuilding self-trust begins with recognizing that the survival mechanisms developed in response to trauma were valid and necessary. However, as healing progresses, restoring trust in your capacity to make decisions, set boundaries, and protect yourself moving forward is essential. Listening to your intuition. Part of rebuilding self-trust is learning to listen to and honor your intuition. Trauma survivors often question their instincts, especially if their boundaries were violated during the traumatic event. Reconnecting with your inner voice and trusting your gut feelings helps restore confidence in navigating life safely and effectively. Small steps toward confidence. Rebuilding self-trust doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process that requires taking small steps toward confidence. This might involve setting boundaries in relationships, making decisions without seeking external validation, or taking calculated risks. Each step reinforces the belief that you can protect and advocate for yourself. Forgiving yourself for past decisions. Many trauma survivors struggle with self-blame, believing that they should have done something differently during the traumatic event. Rebuilding self-trust involves forgiving yourself for any perceived mistakes and recognizing that you did your best. Letting go of guilt is a crucial part of restoring faith in yourself. Rebuilding trust in others. Trauma, especially interpersonal trauma, can severely damage one's ability to trust others. Survivors may feel that people are inherently unsafe, unreliable, or dangerous. However, learning to trust others again is essential for building meaningful relationships and moving forward. Recognizing safe people. One of the first steps in rebuilding trust in others is learning to recognize safe people. Not everyone is trustworthy, and developing discernment regarding relationships is essential. Secure people, respect boundaries, listen without judgment, and support your healing journey. Gradually opening up to safe individuals helps rebuild the belief that not everyone will harm you. Setting boundaries. Trust in others cannot be rebuilt without healthy boundaries. Trauma survivors often struggle with boundaries, either becoming too guarded or too open. Learning to set and maintain clear boundaries allows you to protect yourself while still allowing others into your life. Boundaries create a sense of safety and predictability, which is crucial for rebuilding trust. Taking it slow. Rebuilding trust in others takes time, and it's essential to take it slow. You don't have to trust someone entirely right away. Instead, trust can be built gradually through consistent actions, mutual respect, and open communication. Allow yourself the space to observe how others show up in your life and adjust your level of trust accordingly. Trusting the world again. For many trauma survivors, the trauma event shattered their fundamental belief that the world is a safe and predictable place. Rebuilding trust in the world involves acknowledging life's risks and unpredictability while recognizing that safety and joy are still possible. Balancing safety and risk. Trauma survivors may become overly cautious, avoiding new experiences or opportunities out of fear. While safety is important, it's also crucial to recognize that life involves balancing safety and risk. Learning to take calculated risks, whether in relationships, careers, or personal growth, helps rebuild trust in one's ability to navigate the world. Re-engaging with life. Trauma often leads to withdrawal from life. Survivors may isolate themselves, avoid social situations, or give up on goals they once cared about. Rebuilding trust in the world involves re-engaging with life at your own pace. This could mean pursuing hobbies, reconnecting with friends, or taking on new challenges that bring joy and fulfillment. Critical insight. Rebuilding trust in yourself and others is vital to trauma recovery. This involves listening to your intuition, taking small steps toward confidence, recognizing safe people, and setting healthy boundaries. It's a gradual process that allows survivors to re-engage with life and relationships in a secure and fulfilling way. Reclaiming your life after trauma. The final stage of trauma recovery is about reclaiming your life. This means moving beyond the identity of a survivor and stepping into a new chapter where trauma no longer defines you. Reclaiming your life involves embracing the lessons learned from trauma, finding joy and purpose again, and rebuilding relationships with yourself, others, and the world around you. Redefining yourself. Trauma can create a sense of being trapped in an identity of pain or victimhood. Reclaiming your life means redefining yourself on your own terms. You are not just what happened to you, you are resilient, capable, and deserving of a whole and joyful life. This redefinition allows you to take control of your narrative and embrace a future that is not shaped by your trauma but by your choices and desires. Pursuing joy and fulfillment. pursuing joy and fulfillment are essential as you heal. Trauma often takes away the ability to feel happiness or excitement, but part of reclaiming your life is allowing yourself to experience these emotions again. This might involve exploring new hobbies, cultivating relationships, or setting goals that align with your passions. Building a future you want. Healing from trauma allows you to create a future that reflects your values, dreams, and desires. While the trauma will always be a part of your story, it doesn't have to dictate your future. By embracing healing, finding purpose, and rebuilding trust, you can create a meaningful and rewarding life. Critical insight. Reclaiming your life after trauma involves redefining yourself, pursuing joy, and building a future that aligns with your values and passions. Trauma may be a part of your story, but it does not define your future. Healing takes time and patience, but you regain control of your life with each step forward. Trauma does not define you, it's a chapter in your story, not the entire book. By learning about the stages of recovery, embracing acceptance, practicing forgiveness, and rebuilding trust, you are empowering yourself to thrive. Knowledge is a powerful tool, and sharing what you've learned with others who may be struggling can create a ripple effect of healing. If this book has helped you, consider sharing it with someone who might benefit from its insights. Your journey is proof that transformation is possible, and by spreading that knowledge, you can help others find their own path to strength, peace, and purpose.